When I first met Sam, I thought she hated me. Not in a dramatic, soap opera way, but in the quiet, effortless way that some people seem to just radiate disdain. She had this sharp, angular way of speaking, like her words were weapons she'd been sharpening all morning. Even her smile felt like it had an edge, like it was less about kindness and more about politely letting you know she was better at everything than you'd ever be. We were paired up for a community theater production, a comedy, ironically, and the moment our director introduced us as scene partners, Sam just gave me a look. Not a welcoming look, not even a neutral one. It was the kind of look someone gives a burnt piece of toast before deciding whether it's worth scraping off the char or just tossing it entirely. Her first words to me? "So, you're playing Greg?" I nodded, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, that's me." Her response, "Huh, bold choice." What was that supposed to mean? I spent the rest of the first rehearsal convinced she thought I was terrible. To be fair, I kind of was. I kept tripping over my lines, forgetting where to stand, and at one point, I accidentally knocked over a fake potted plant that was apparently a very important part of the set design. Through it all, Sam watched me with this unreadable expression. Not annoyed, not amused, just clinical. Like I was an experiment she wasn't sure was worth continuing. That night, I went home and ran into my roommate. "She's so smug," I said, pacing the living room. "It's like she's just waiting for me to mess up so she can swoop in and say, 'I told you so.'" My roommate, bless him, barely looked up from his video game. "Maybe she's just shy," he offered. "Shy?" I scoffed. "She has the social grace of a Bond villain. She's not shy. She's plotting my downfall." But the weird thing about Sam was that she never actually said anything mean. She didn't criticize me, didn't roll her eyes when I flubbed my lines for the 5th time, didn't sigh dramatically when I accidentally stepped on her foot during blocking practice. She just observed. Then, during our 4th rehearsal, everything shifted. We were running a scene where my character had to deliver this long, awkward monologue while Sam's character just stared at me, unimpressed. I was floundering, as usual, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. Halfway through, I paused to take a breath, and Sam suddenly said, "You know, you're overthinking it." I blinked at her. "Overthinking what?" "Everything," she said, gesturing vaguely at me. "The lines, the movements, the pauses. You're trying so hard to get it perfect that you're missing the point." I bristled. "And what's the point?" "The point," she said, leaning back like this was the most obvious thing in the world, "is that Greg is a disaster. He's not supposed to be smooth. He's supposed to be messy and awkward and real. Just stop trying so hard." Her words stung at first, but there was something in the way she said them, like she wasn't judging me, just stating a fact. And weirdly, it made sense. The next time we ran the scene, I stopped thinking about where to stand or how to angle my shoulders or whether my voice sounded right. I just let myself be awkward. And for the first time, it actually worked. When the scene ended, Sam gave me a small nod. Not a smile, not a compliment, just a nod. But it felt like I'd won an Olympic medal. After that, things started to change between us. During breaks, she'd sit next to me and make these dry, offhand comments about the rehearsal. "Did you notice how Jerry somehow managed to be out of breath in a scene where he's sitting down?" Or, "I'm pretty sure our director hates me. She called me Sarah twice today." Her humor was so deadpan that it took me a while to realize she was actually joking. I started looking forward to those moments, to the way her face would relax just slightly when she was amused, to the way her sarcasm felt less like a shield and more like an invitation. One day, we were both early for rehearsal, and she noticed me sketching in a notebook. I'd been drawing since I was a kid, but it wasn't something I showed people. Sam, however, just leaned over and said, "What's that?" "Nothing," I said, instinctively closing the notebook. She raised an eyebrow. "It doesn't look like nothing. It looks like a dragon in a business suit." I hesitated, then slowly opened the notebook. "It's, my version of our director." She stared at the sketch for a moment, then burst out laughing. Like, actually laughing. Not the polite chuckle I'd heard before, but a real, full-bodied laugh that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "You're weird," she said, grinning. "You're one to talk," I shot back, and to my surprise, she didn't argue. By the time opening night rolled around, Sam and I had fallen into an easy rhythm. On stage, we had this electric chemistry that made every joke land and every awkward pause feel intentional. Off stage, we were constantly bickering in a way that wasn't quite flirting but wasn't not flirting either. After the final performance, the cast went out for drinks to celebrate. I ended up sitting next to Sam, and for once, she didn't have her usual guarded demeanor. She was relaxed, laughing freely, even making fun of herself. At one point, she turned to me and said, "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were hopeless." I pretended to be offended. "Hopeless? That's harsh." She smirked. "Well, you were, but you grew on me." "And now?" I asked, half joking, half holding my breath. She tilted her head, considering. "Now, I think you're the kind of weird I can work with." It wasn't the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me, but coming from Sam, it felt like a confession. We've been together for 2 years now. Sometimes, she still gives me that look, the burnt toast look, but now it makes me laugh. Because I know, deep down, she's thinking the same thing I am. Maybe some things are worth saving. Have you ever completely misjudged someone and been hilariously, wonderfully wrong? The other day, I was walking through my neighborhood when I passed one of those little free libraries. You know, the tiny wooden boxes on a post where people leave books for others to take or borrow. It was painted a cheerful yellow, and its door creaked when I opened it. Inside, nestled between a Stephen King novel with a bent spine and a dog-eared cookbook from the 1980s, was a DVD of The Matrix. A DVD. I don't even have a DVD player anymore, but for some reason, the sight of it stopped me in my tracks. I stood there for a moment, staring at this relic of the not-so-distant past, and wondered if anyone would actually take it. Or better yet, if someone would return it, like the DVD had a secret life of its own, hopping from box to box like a vagabond. It made me think about how strange it is that we don't really own our entertainment anymore. Once upon a time, a DVD collection was a point of pride, a monument to your taste in movies. You could stand in front of it and feel like a curator of culture, running your fingers along the plastic cases until you found just the right film for the evening. Now, everything's streamed, algorithmically suggested, and stored in some distant server farm. There's no browsing anymore, no serendipity, no accidentally finding the wrong movie because you misread the title and discovering a new favorite. Instead, it's just endless thumbnails on a screen, beckoning us to click and consume. Convenient? Absolutely. But I can't help but feel like something's been lost in the trade. A block later, I passed by a coffee shop and saw a line of people waiting outside, their faces bathed in the glow of their phones. Not one of them was talking to each other. I wondered what they were all looking at. Text messages? Work emails? Videos of raccoons stealing cat food? It's impossible to tell. And yet, if I'm honest, I can't judge them too harshly. I do the same thing. We all do. It's become a kind of reflex, hasn't it? Standing in line used to mean awkwardly staring into space or making small talk about the weather. Now it's a race to see how many notifications you can clear before the barista calls your name. But here's the part that made me smile. As I walked past, I saw this little girl, maybe 6 or 7, tugging at her dad's sleeve. She wasn't holding a phone, wasn't swiping or tapping. Instead, she was holding a tiny notebook and a pencil. She kept showing him these little doodles she'd been making. Some flowers, a bird, what looked like a spaceship piloted by a cat. Her dad was half listening, nodding absently while glancing at his phone. But then she said something, and he laughed. Not the polite, "That's nice, sweetie" kind of laugh, but a real, genuine laugh that made him put his phone away and crouch down to look at her drawings. That moment? That was pure magic. It reminded me that no matter how much technology changes us, there's still something irresistible about a child's imagination. I thought about that girl for the rest of the day. It's funny how kids have this way of ignoring the rules we've all unconsciously agreed on. The rule that says you need to stare at your phone to pass the time. The rule that says you should keep your creativity to yourself unless it's polished and perfect and Instagram-worthy. She broke both of those rules without even trying, and I found myself envying her a little. When was the last time I carried a notebook around just to doodle in? Or struck up a conversation with someone in line, just for the heck of it? Later, I ended up at the park, where I saw something that felt equally rare. A group of teenagers hanging out without any screens in sight. They were sitting in a circle on the grass, talking and laughing and passing around a bag of chips. One of them had a ukulele, and she was strumming a tune while the others sang along. Badly, but with total enthusiasm. It was chaotic and goofy and perfect. I felt like I'd stumbled into a time warp, like someone had dropped a scene from the 1970s into the middle of the digital age. And you know what? It was refreshing. I wanted to walk up to them and say, "Please, never stop doing this." But of course I didn't. Instead, I just sat on a nearby bench and watched, feeling like I'd been given a glimpse of something rare and precious, like spotting a fox darting through the woods. On the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about how different life feels when you take a step back and notice these little moments. The analog moments, I guess you could call them. They're still there, even in this hyper-connected, always online world. A kid with a notebook, a group of friends singing off-key, a forgotten DVD sitting in a tiny library. It's like finding hidden Easter eggs in the video game of modern life. They're small, maybe even insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but they remind you that there's more to the world than notifications and streaming queues and whatever the algorithm thinks you want next. When I got home, I decided to do something completely out of character. I turned off my phone, dug an old notebook out of a drawer, and sat down to write. Not a text or an email, but an actual letter. I didn't have anyone in mind to send it to, so I just wrote about my day, the DVD, the girl in line, the singing teenagers. I wrote about how strange and wonderful it is to live in a time where we're so connected and yet so disconnected, where we can watch movies on demand but sometimes forget to stop and notice the little stories playing out around us. When I was done, I folded the letter and stuck it in a book on my shelf. Maybe one day, someone will find it, like I found my grandmother's letters, and it'll make them smile. Or maybe I'll forget about it entirely and stumble across it myself years from now. Either way, it felt good to leave something behind. So, what about you? What's the last moment that made you stop and think, life's pretty weird, but also kind of wonderful? It was a Tuesday, one of those achingly ordinary days where the hours blend together like an overcast sky. The kind of day that usually passes unnoticed, filed away in the vast archives of the mundane. I was sitting in the park during my lunch break, picking at a sandwich I wasn't even hungry for, more out of habit than anything else. The office was unbearable, buzzing with the low hum of fluorescent lights and hushed conversations about quarterly reports. I didn't expect anything from the day. Not a surprise, not an interruption, not even a decent breeze to cut through the sticky summer air. There was a squirrel nearby, a particularly bold one, inching closer to my bench with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of stealing snacks from distracted humans. It cocked its head, eyeing me like it was sizing me up, deciding if I was worth the effort. I broke off a corner of my bread and tossed it toward the ground, figuring it would take the hint and leave me alone. Instead, it scurried up to the bench, snatched the piece, and sat there staring at me, uncomfortably still, as if it had something important to say. I found myself talking to it, mostly to break the awkwardness. "You've got a good racket going here, don't you?" I muttered. It twitched its tail, still watching me. "What you want more?" "Greedy little thing." I tossed another piece, and as it darted forward to grab it, something caught my eye. Around the squirrel's neck, like a tiny, makeshift collar, was a piece of red thread. It was knotted neatly, snug but not tight, as though someone had placed it there deliberately. I leaned forward, curious, and the squirrel darted back, clutching its bread like it was fleeing a crime scene. I'd like to think I'm not the kind of person who chases squirrels, but there I was, abandoning my lunch and jogging after this little creature as it zigzagged across the park. It wasn't a conscious decision. Something about that red thread had hooked me, and I couldn't let it go. The squirrel eventually disappeared into the underbrush near a cluster of trees, leaving me standing there, hands on my hips, feeling both ridiculous and strangely exhilarated. That's when I saw it. A tiny wooden box nestled at the base of one of the trees. It was about the size of a shoebox, but older, weathered, with carvings etched into the surface. The designs were intricate, almost like vines, curling and looping around each other. For a moment, I just stood there, staring, unsure if I was even allowed to touch it. It felt private, like I'd stumbled into someone else's world. But curiosity won out, as it always does, and I crouched down to open it. Inside was a collection of small, mismatched objects. A rusted key, a handful of marbles, a faded Polaroid of a cat sitting in a sunbeam, a coin that looked foreign but worn smooth, and a folded piece of paper that had been carefully tucked into the corner. It felt like a time capsule, but not the kind you bury for decades. This felt active, alive, as though someone had just been here, filling it with fragments of themselves. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, half expecting it to crumble in my fingers. Written in a looping, elegant script were the words, "If you found this, you're part of the story now. Leave something behind and take what you need." I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that note. The world around me seemed to dissolve into the background. The sound of kids playing, the rumble of traffic, the heat of the sun on my neck. I felt like I'd tripped and fallen into some strange pocket of reality where the rules were different, softer, like the universe was letting me borrow someone else's magic for a moment. I didn't have much with me, just my wallet, my phone, and the sandwich I'd abandoned. After a moment's hesitation, I slipped my subway pass out of my wallet. It wasn't much, just a flimsy little card with a few bucks left on it, but it felt like the right thing to leave behind. A token of passage, maybe. I placed it gently in the box and, after some deliberation, took the Polaroid. The cat looked so serene, so utterly content that I couldn't resist. It felt like the kind of peace I'd been searching for without even realizing it. I closed the box and left it where I'd found it, brushing dirt over it to conceal it slightly, as though I was tucking it back into the earth. The squirrel reappeared as I stood up, watching me with that same unervingly direct gaze. For a brief, ridiculous moment, I wondered if it was judging my contribution, but then it darted off again, red thread flashing like a tiny flag. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I kept the Polaroid on my desk, propped up against my computer monitor, and every so often I'd catch myself staring at it, wondering about the person, or people, who had started the box. How many others had found it? What had they left behind? What had they taken with them? I wanted to go back, to dig through it again, to see if anyone else had added to it, but something held me back. Maybe it was the feeling that the magic was too fragile, that trying to capture it again might shatter it. Or maybe it was enough to know that it was there, that it existed, and that for one strange, beautiful moment, it had found me. I still have the Polaroid. It's on my bookshelf now, tucked between novels I've been meaning to read. Sometimes, when I catch a glimpse of it, I think about that squirrel, the red thread, and the box under the tree. I wonder if it's still there, or if it's moved on, carried to some other corner of the world where someone else needs a little mystery in their life. And I wonder if, somewhere, someone is looking at my subway pass and imagining the person who left it behind. Have you ever stumbled across something that felt like it was left just for you? Something that made you feel, for a moment, like the world was letting you in on a secret? When I was 23, I spent 6 weeks living in an old camper van that I bought off a guy on Craigslist for $2,000. The van smelled like burnt coffee and mildew, and the engine had this unnerving cough that made every uphill drive feel like gambling with fate. But it was mine. It had a tiny stove that only worked half the time, a mattress so thin you could feel the springs, and, most importantly, it represented something I'd been chasing for months: freedom. I was running, though I told myself I was just exploring. Running from my desk job, where I spent 8 hours a day pretending spreadsheets were my passion. Running from a breakup that had left me convinced I'd peaked emotionally at 22. And running from the overwhelming, paralyzing question of what the hell I was supposed to do with my life. The van was my solution, my way of pressing pause on a world that felt like it was moving too fast while I was moving too slow. The plan was simple. No plan, just me, a roadmap, and enough savings to last until I either found clarity or ran out of gas money. It sounded romantic in theory, the kind of thing you'd write a self-help book about later, how I found myself on the open road, or something equally cliché. In practice, it was mostly me arguing with the GPS, eating gas station granola bars, and trying to avoid eye contact with suspicious strangers in rest stop parking lots. But it wasn't all bad. The sunsets were nice. The solitude felt strangely comforting. I wasn't exactly happy, but I wasn't miserable either, which, at the time, felt like progress. Then, somewhere outside a tiny town in Utah, the van broke down. And I mean really broke down. Smoke pouring out from under the hood. A sound like metal being ripped apart from the inside. It was dramatic, as far as breakdowns go. I pulled off the road and stared at the engine like I had any idea how to fix it, which of course I didn't. It was late afternoon, the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no sign of another car for miles. The sun was sinking fast, and I was starting to panic, wondering if this was how people ended up as cautionary tales and survival documentaries. Then, out of the blue, a rusty old pickup truck appeared on the horizon. The driver was an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, with a sun-weathered face and a braid that hung over one shoulder like a rope. She introduced herself as Joe, offered me a lift to the nearest town, and didn't seem the least bit fazed when I hesitated. "Suit yourself," she said, leaning casually against her truck. "But the coyotes get loud after dark, and you look like you're fresh meat." That got me moving. I grabbed my backpack, locked the van, and climbed into her truck, which smelled faintly of lavender and motor oil. On the way to town, I tried to explain my road trip of self-discovery in a way that didn't make me sound like a total idiot, but Joe just listened, nodding occasionally, her expression unreadable. When we reached town, a cluster of buildings so small it could barely be called a town, she pulled into the gravel lot of a repair shop. She hopped out, talked to the mechanic like they were old friends, because they probably were, and arranged for someone to tow my van in the morning. I thanked her profusely, but she just waved me off and told me there was a diner down the street if I needed dinner. "Don't order the meatloaf," she said, "unless you're feeling adventurous." I ended up at that diner anyway, too tired to care about the quality of the meatloaf, though I went with a grilled cheese just to be safe. Halfway through my meal, Joe walked in and slid into the booth across from me without asking. She ordered coffee, black, and asked if I had a place to stay for the night. I didn't, so she offered me the couch in her living room. I hesitated again, because I was young and wary and had watched too many crime dramas to trust strangers, but there was something about Joe that felt steady and unshakable, like the desert itself. So, for the second time that day, I said yes. Her house was small and cluttered but warm in a way that made me forget I'd only just met her. Books were stacked in every corner, and the walls were covered in framed photographs of places I couldn't name. She handed me a quilt and a pillow, and we ended up talking for hours, though I can't remember half of what we said. What I do remember is the story she told me about her own road trip, taken decades earlier, in a car so unreliable she'd had to push it up a hill more than once. She said she'd been running, too, though she didn't say from what, and that by the time the car finally gave out for good, she'd learned that running doesn't get you anywhere if you're not willing to stop and take a look around. The next morning, Joe drove me back to the repair shop, and after paying an eye-watering amount of money to fix the van, I was back on the road. But something had shifted. I didn't feel as restless, as desperate to outrun my thoughts. I started taking the slower routes, pulling over to watch the sunrise or talk to strangers, or just sit quietly with my own company. I still didn't know what I was doing with my life, but for the first time, that felt okay. I never saw Joe again, though I think about her often. She probably doesn't remember me, or if she does, I'm just the girl with the broken van. But she taught me something I didn't even know I needed to learn, that freedom isn't about escaping. It's about being present, about letting the road take you somewhere, instead of trying so hard to control where it goes. So, I'm curious, has a stranger ever changed the way you see the world? Someone you barely knew, or only met once, but who left an impression that stayed with you? I'd love to hear your stories. It wasn't something we planned. I don't think rituals ever are, not the ones that really matter. Ours grew out of an accident, a night when neither of us could sleep. It was one of those heavy summer nights where the air feels like wet wool, and even the ceiling fan spinning on high isn't enough. We'd kicked off the sheets hours earlier and were lying there, side by side but not touching, each of us pretending not to notice the other's restlessness. I could hear the faint hum of the neighbor's window AC unit next door, and it made me jealous in a stupid way. I thought about suggesting we turn on a podcast or scroll through Netflix, but the idea of adding noise to the silence felt like a betrayal. Then she turned her head toward me and whispered, "Let's go get pancakes." It was 2:14 a.m. I remember the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock on my phone every 5 minutes, willing it to move faster. I blinked at her, half convinced I'd imagined it, but she was already sitting up, her hair messy and her face lit by that mix of mischief and determination that I'd fallen in love with. "Pancakes?" I repeated, like I didn't understand the concept. She nodded. "There's an all-night diner like 3 blocks away. Let's just go." It felt absurd, and that was exactly why I said yes. I grabbed a hoodie and a pair of flip-flops, and she threw on one of my old t-shirts over her pajama shorts. We probably looked ridiculous, 2 sleep-deprived idiots wandering through a half-asleep neighborhood in the middle of the night. The streets were so quiet that our footsteps on the sidewalk sounded louder than they should have. The air outside was cooler than I'd expected, and it smelled faintly of wet grass, even though it hadn't rained. The diner was this old, greasy place with sticky booths and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly if you sat in the wrong spot. The waitress barely looked up from her phone as she led us to a table in the corner and handed us menus. She had that world-weary vibe that comes from serving drunk college kids and insomniacs at ungodly hours. We ordered pancakes, obviously. Hers with chocolate chips, mine plain. The waitress smirked a little, like she couldn't decide if we were cute or just pathetic. When the pancakes came, they weren't particularly good. They were the kind of pancakes that taste like they came from a box mix, a little too dry around the edges. But it didn't matter. She started cutting hers into tiny, perfect triangles, stacking them into little towers before eating them. I asked her why she was doing it, and she said, completely seriously, "Because the triangles taste better." I laughed so hard I almost choked on my coffee. She joined in, and for a minute, it felt like the whole diner belonged to us. Just 2 people in a fluorescent bubble of light and bad coffee, sharing something that felt weirdly sacred. That night became the first of many. Not always pancakes. Sometimes we'd end up at the taco truck that parked in front of the gas station 3 blocks over, or the 24-hour bodega with the weirdly good deli counter. Sometimes we didn't even eat. We'd just walk around until the stars started to fade and the birds began their tentative morning chatter. It wasn't about the food or even the destination. It was about the strangeness of being awake when the world was sleeping, the sense that we were stealing time from the universe, making something secret and ours. Once, we found ourselves sitting on the swings at the little park by the elementary school, eating sandwiches we'd made at home and carried in paper towels like kids going on a field trip. The chains creaked softly as we swung back and forth, our feet brushing the wood chips below. She told me about the time she'd fallen off a swing in 2nd grade and broken her arm. "I was convinced they'd have to cut it off," she said, laughing. "I didn't understand how bones worked." I told her about the summer I tried to teach myself to do a backflip off the monkey bars and ended up with a chipped tooth for my efforts. We laughed until tears streaked down our faces, until my jaw ached from smiling. Not all the nights were lighthearted. There was one where she told me about the fight she'd had with her mom that day. The kind of fight that left wounds that didn't show but hurt just as much. Another night, after I lost my job, we ended up sitting on the curb outside the diner, splitting a slice of pecan pie and passing the fork back and forth in silence while I tried not to cry. She didn't tell me it would be okay, didn't try to fix it. She just kept handing me the fork, letting me eat more than my share, until the worst of the knot in my chest loosened. What I loved most about those nights was how they made the world feel smaller, quieter. It was like stepping into a parallel version of reality, one where we weren't bound by the usual rules of time and responsibility. It felt like we could say or do anything in those hours and leave it behind when the sun came up. We started calling it stolen time. Whenever one of us was feeling restless or sad or just off, we'd look at the other and say, "Want to steal some time?" It became our shorthand for escaping the noise of life, for slipping into a place that belonged to no one but us. Over the years, the ritual shifted and stretched to fit the rhythms of our lives. There were months when we didn't need it, when life felt so full and good that there was no reason to sneak out into the night. And there were stretches when we leaned on it heavily, when it felt like the only thing keeping us tethered to each other and to ourselves. Even now, I think about those nights whenever the insomnia creeps in. when the house feels too big and the bed feels too small. I'll catch myself glancing at the clock, wondering if she's lying awake too, thinking about pancakes or taco trucks or swing sets. So, I'm curious, what's your version of stolen time? What are the rituals, the small and sacred escapes that keep your world spinning? I was in the middle of cleaning out my refrigerator when it happened. One of those lazy Saturday afternoons where you finally muster up the energy to deal with all the little domestic horrors you've been avoiding for weeks. The fridge was bad. Not just, oh, there's an old takeout container bad. Archaeological excavation bad. I pulled out a jar of pickles with a best-by date that suggested they might have lived through at least one election cycle. A bag of something that had once been carrots but now looked like the aftermath of a bad science experiment. And, in the very back, a Tupperware I didn't recognize. The Tupperware felt heavier than it should, which is never a good sign. I opened it cautiously, like it might hiss at me or release a sentient puff of spores. Inside was, well, I'm not entirely sure. Something grayish-green, partially liquid, and fully menacing. It might have been chili, or curry, or something else entirely. Whatever it was, it had clearly given up on being food and embraced its new identity as a biohazard. I gagged, slammed the lid shut, and tossed the whole container into the trash. Some battles you just don't fight. As I stood there, staring at my slightly emptier, slightly cleaner fridge, I noticed something shiny tucked behind the crisper drawer. Curious, I reached back and pulled it out. It was a single metal key, small and unremarkable, tied to a faded piece of red string. My first thought was, how did this even get in here? My second thought was, what does it open? I held the key in my hand like it was a puzzle I'd been handed by fate. There was no obvious explanation. It didn't belong to my apartment. I already knew what my front door key looked like. It didn't match the mailbox key either. I turned it over and over in my palm, trying to remember if I'd seen it before. Nothing. I even checked the freezer, as if the answer might be hiding in there next to the long-forgotten bag of peas. No luck. That's when the thought struck me. What if this wasn't my key at all? What if it belonged to the people who lived here before me? I'd moved into the apartment almost 2 years ago, but I'd never thought much about the previous tenants. They'd left behind a few random nails in the wall and one hideous lampshade, but nothing personal. A key, though? That felt different. It felt deliberate. I spent the rest of the afternoon obsessing over it. I held it up to every lock I could think of. The storage unit in the basement, the padlocked gate to the alley behind the building, even the old desk I'd bought off Craigslist. None of them budged. By the time the sun set, I was no closer to solving the mystery, but the key had taken on a strange kind of weight in my mind. It felt like it wanted me to figure it out, like some small but insistent tug at the edge of my thoughts. The next day, I brought it to work. I didn't mean to. It was just still sitting on my kitchen counter, and on a whim, I slipped it into my pocket before heading out the door. During my lunch break, I found myself absent-mindedly spinning it between my fingers, and my coworker Jenny noticed. "What's that?" she asked, leaning over my cubicle wall. I told her about finding it in the fridge and how I had no idea what had opened. She gasped like I just handed her the plot of a murder mystery. "Oh my God, that's so creepy," she said, eyes wide. "What if it opens like a secret room in the building, or a locker full of cash, or—" She paused dramatically. "A diary." "A diary?" I laughed. "What? Locked away behind a hidden door for me to stumble across like some kind of budget Indiana Jones." "I'm just saying," she replied, grinning. "Keys are never just keys in stories. They always lead to something." That thought stuck with me. Maybe it was silly, but for the next few days, the key became my secret little obsession. I brought it with me everywhere, half joking with myself that it might suddenly reveal its purpose. I kept picturing dramatic possibilities. A treasure chest hidden in my building, a long-lost heirloom, maybe even a letter addressed to me, explaining everything in poetic detail. But, of course, nothing happened. It was just a key. Until Thursday. I was walking home from work, key still in my coat pocket, when I noticed something new on the block. A tiny, second-hand bookstore I'd never seen before. The sign above the door read "The Hidden Shelf" in faded gold lettering, and something about it pulled me in. It wasn't flashy, just a cozy, dimly lit shop with shelves that seemed to sag under the weight of too many books. The smell of old paper and dust hit me the second I walked in, and for some reason, it felt like I belonged there. As I wandered through the aisles, my hand brushed against my coat pocket, where the key rested. On impulse, I pulled it out and turned it over in my hand. And then, almost like it was magnetic, my gaze landed on an old, battered lockbox sitting on a high shelf, wedged between two massive encyclopedias. I don't know why, but I froze. My heart started pounding. I pulled the box down, examining it carefully. It was small and scratched, the kind of thing you'd find at a garage sale for $1. But the lock on it? It looked like it might fit my key. My hands were shaking as I slid the key in and turned it. A click echoed in the quiet store. Inside was a piece of paper, folded into quarters. My fingers felt clumsy as I opened it. Written in shaky, looping handwriting were the words, "You found it. Don't stop looking." I stared at the paper for what felt like an eternity, the words sending a shiver up my spine. I wanted to ask the shopkeeper where the box had come from, but when I looked around, I realized I hadn't seen anyone else in the store the entire time. When I left, the bell above the door jingling softly behind me, I turned back to look at the sign. But the shop was gone. So here I am, with a cryptic note and more questions than answers. Have you ever stumbled into something small and strange that made you wonder if the universe was nudging you towards something bigger? The mail always arrived at 3:15 p.m. in Hollow Pines. It was one of the few constants in the town, along with the low hum of the power station and the way the clouds always seemed to gather just before sundown, regardless of the forecast. Margot watched the mail truck trundle down the cracked asphalt from her front porch, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Today was different, though. She knew it before the truck even stopped. The driver, a wiry man named Dale who had been delivering mail since before Margot was born, hesitated as he stepped out. His eyes darted toward her, then back to the heavy canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Margot stood, brushing imaginary dust off her jeans, and met him halfway down the driveway. "You've got something," Dale said, his voice tight. He handed her a small, flat package wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address, just her name and a single black symbol inked onto the corner, a circle bisected by a jagged line. "What is this?" Margot asked, but Dale was already walking away, his pace hurried. She turned the package over in her hands. It was light, almost weightless, and cold to the touch. Back inside, she used a pair of scissors to slit the paper, revealing a thin, square object wrapped in black cloth. When she peeled the cloth away, her breath caught. It was a mirror. The surface was impossibly smooth, more like liquid than glass, and as she tilted it in the light, it reflected not her living room but something else entirely. A forest stretched out inside the mirror's frame, dense with gnarled trees and a strange, silver mist that curled like smoke. Margot leaned closer, her face inches from the surface, when the image shifted. Something moved in the mist. She dropped the mirror onto the table with a clatter and stepped back, her pulse racing. For a moment, she considered calling someone. Her sister, maybe, or the sheriff. But what would she even say? That a mirror had been delivered to her doorstep and it showed things that shouldn't be there? The forest in the mirror was still now, silent and unmoving, as if daring her to doubt what she'd seen. That night, Margot dreamed of the forest. She walked among the twisted trees, the air thick with the scent of pine and decay. The mist clung to her skin, cold and alive, and somewhere in the distance, she heard whispers, words she couldn't quite make out, pulling her deeper into the woods. When she woke, the whispers lingered, faint but persistent. The mirror sat on the table where she'd left it, its surface dark and blank in the morning light. Margot told herself to throw it away, to bury it, to leave it at the edge of town with a note that said, "Do not touch." But when she picked it up, the forest was there again, vivid and undeniable. This time, the mist parted, revealing a figure standing at the edge of a clearing. It was a woman, draped in tattered black cloth, her face obscured by a veil. The woman raised a hand, beckoning. "Come closer," the woman's voice echoed, though her lips didn't move. Margot stumbled back, dropping the mirror once more. She didn't sleep that night. By the third day, she knew she couldn't ignore it. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, and every time she passed the mirror, the woman was there, waiting. Margot packed a small bag, water, a flashlight, her grandfather's hunting knife, and sat down in front of the mirror. Her reflection was gone, replaced entirely by the forest. "I don't know what you want," she said aloud, her voice trembling. The woman in the mirror tilted her head, and the mist swirled violently, as if stirred by an unseen wind. The jagged line on the corner of the package appeared on the woman's outstretched hand, glowing faintly. Margot touched the mirror's surface, and the world shifted. She was standing in the forest, her boots sinking into the damp earth. The air was heavy with the same pine and decay smell from her dream, and the whispers were everywhere now, overlapping and urgent. She turned, searching for the woman, but the clearing was empty. The forest was alive in a way she'd never felt before. The trees seemed to watch her, their branches creaking as they swayed without wind. The mist coiled around her legs, tugging gently as if guiding her somewhere. Ahead, she saw the faint glow of firelight. She followed it, her heart pounding with every step, until she reached a small circle of stones. In the center was the mirror, propped against a tree, its surface reflecting her living room. "Why?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was asking. The whispers stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Margot spun around, knife in hand, and saw the woman from the mirror standing at the edge of the circle. Up close, the veil was translucent, and Margot could make out the woman's features, sharp, delicate, and eerily familiar. "You were called," the woman said. Her voice was soft, but it carried an authority that made Margot's skin crawl. "And you answered." "I didn't ask for this," Margot said, her grip on the knife tightening. The woman smiled faintly. "You didn't need to." Before Margot could respond, the woman raised her hand, and the world around them began to dissolve. The trees melted into shadows, the mist evaporated, and Margot felt herself being pulled backward, as though the earth itself was dragging her away. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her living room, the mirror sitting on the table. The forest was gone, but her reflection stared back at her, except it wasn't her. The woman in the veil smiled from the other side, and Margot realized the whispers hadn't stopped. The day was perfectly ordinary in the way that makes you forget it almost as soon as it ends. It was one of those mid-January afternoons when the world feels like it's holding its breath, and everything just seems cold and gray without the magic of the holidays to distract you. I'd been running errands, nothing exciting, just groceries and a quick trip to the post office, and as I walked back to my car, I passed a thrift store I hadn't noticed before. Something about it made me pause. Maybe it was the faint buzz of the neon open sign that flickered in the window, or the slightly crooked display of mismatched mugs and old books behind the glass. I wasn't in a rush, so I went in, more out of boredom than anything else. The smell hit me first. It was that faint, musty scent you only find in places that have seen too many lives pass through them. It smelled like damp paperbacks and worn-out furniture, with a hint of mothballs lingering in the air. I wandered aimlessly, running my fingers across the racks of forgotten clothes and shelves of chipped ceramics. Nothing stood out until I reached the back corner, where the lighting was dim and the air felt a little heavier, like even time had slowed down back there. That's when I saw it. A beaten-up wooden box sitting on a low shelf, half hidden behind some dusty glass jars. It looked like it had been painted white at some point, but most of the paint had chipped away, leaving bare wood underneath. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, but I couldn't stop staring at it. Something about it felt familiar, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I crouched down and lifted the lid, and inside was a mess of random trinkets. Loose buttons, a couple of rusty keys, a broken pocket watch, and, at the very bottom, a small stack of Polaroid photos tied together with a fraying ribbon. I pulled the photos out, and the moment I untied the ribbon, it hit me. That smell. Not the thrift store smell, but something underneath it. It was faint, barely there, but unmistakable. The smell of old sunscreen mixed with salty air and sun-warmed sand. My throat tightened, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. I flipped through the photos, my hands trembling slightly. They weren't mine. They couldn't be, but they felt like they were. The first one was of a beach at sunset, the kind where the sky melts into the water in shades of gold and pink, so bright it almost doesn't look real. The second was a close-up of a sandcastle, half collapsed and surrounded by tiny footprints. The third was a blurred shot of a girl running along the shore, her hair flying behind her like a comet's tail. I couldn't see her face, but I didn't need to. I knew that girl. She was me, or at least, she was who I used to be. When I was 8, my parents used to take me to this tiny beach town every summer. It wasn't fancy or glamorous, just a strip of sand, a boardwalk with a couple of food stands, and a creaky old carousel that always smelled faintly of popcorn. But to me, it was magic. I'd spend hours building castles in the sand, trying to make them big enough and strong enough to survive the tide. I never could, but that didn't stop me from trying. I'd run along the shore until my legs ached, chasing seagulls and picking up shells, believing each one was a treasure. I thought I'd forgotten all about that place. It had been years since we'd gone, and even longer since I'd let myself think about it. But here it was in my hands, as clear as if I'd just been there yesterday. The last photo in the stack was different. It wasn't the beach. It was a close-up of a hand holding a small glass bottle, the kind you might find washed up on the shore. Inside the bottle was a tiny rolled-up piece of paper, tied with a piece of string. I stared at it, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. I flipped it over, hoping for some kind of explanation, but there was nothing on the back, just the photo. I tucked the photos back into the box and took the whole thing up to the counter. The cashier barely looked at it as she rang it up, and I left feeling like I'd just stolen something important, though I'd paid for it fair and square. When I got home, I pulled the photos out again, examining them one by one like I was searching for a hidden message. Something about that last photo wouldn't let me go. I must have stared at it for an hour before I finally gave in to the urge to dig through my own closet. I knew it was a long shot. There was no way I'd find what I was looking for after all this time. But I had to try. I found the shoebox buried under a pile of old clothes. It was heavier than I remembered, the lid barely holding together. I pulled it open, and there it was, right on top. My own little glass bottle. My 8-year-old self had been obsessed with the idea of sending messages in bottles, convinced they'd travel across oceans to find some far-off stranger. I'd only ever actually sent one, but I'd kept this one for myself, rolling up a little note and sealing it in the bottle like it was a secret treasure. I pulled it out, my hands shaking as I untied the string and unrolled the paper. The handwriting was barely legible, the kind of uneven scrawl only a kid could produce, but I recognized it instantly. "Dear future me," it said. "I hope you're happy. Don't forget the beach." That was it. No profound wisdom, no long message, just those 2 sentences. And yet, I sat there on the floor, clutching that stupid piece of paper, crying like I hadn't in years. I didn't even realize how much I'd forgotten. Not just the beach, but her. The girl who believed in messages in bottles, who thought every shell was a treasure and every sunset was magic. I don't know when I stopped being her, but holding that note in my hands, I realized how much I missed her. I've been back to the beach once since then. It's changed, of course, everything does, but it still smells the same. Sunscreen, salt, and sun-warmed sand. I didn't stay long, but I didn't need to. It was enough just to remember. Have you ever stumbled across something? A smell, a picture, a forgotten object that made you remember who you used to be? I woke up to the sound of applause. Slow, deliberate clapping, like whoever was doing it wanted me to know they weren't impressed but were willing to acknowledge my basic ability to exist. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the foot of my bed. I sat up groggily, rubbed my face, and there, on the dresser, was my wallet, standing on its folded edge, clapping its little leather flaps together like hands. "Congratulations," it said in a voice that could only be described as passive-aggressively posh. Another morning of financial genius, waking up in his lavish kingdom. Tell me, how does it feel to owe half of your soul to the credit card company? I stared. The wallet tilted slightly, as if it were trying to cross its arms, but realized it didn't have any. Nothing to say? Shocking. Much like your spending habits. There was a long silence before I found the words. You talk? The wallet sighed dramatically. No, I yodel. Of course I talk. And let me tell you, I've got plenty to say. About your Amazon purchases. About your coffee habit. About that tactical pin you bought at 3 a.m. last week because you were convinced you'd be the next Jason Bourne. Shall I go on? Before I could respond, a sharp voice interrupted from the bookshelf. Oh, leave him alone, Billfold, it said. You're not so special. Do you remember when he left you in the washing machine for 2 cycles? Because I do. I turned to see who, or what, had jumped to my defense. It was my paperback copy of Dune. The corners of its cover were bent like a boxer cracking his knuckles. Its voice was low and gravelly, like a grizzled war veteran who'd seen some things. You've got no right to talk down to anyone, it growled. At least he uses you. You think I enjoy sitting here, half-read, while he rewatches Parks and Recreation for the 5th time. I'm a classic, for crying out loud. This seemed to strike a nerve in the room. From the desk, my laptop perked up, its screen flickering like an old neon sign. Oh, please, it said. Its voice clipped and nasal, like a tech support rep who just hit hour 4 of their shift. If we're going to talk about neglect, how about the fact that he still hasn't cleaned my keyboard? I have crumbs in places you don't even want to think about. And don't get me started on the number of tabs he keeps open. I'm one Control+T away from a meltdown. The room had become a free-for-all. My phone chimed in next, buzzing indignantly from the bedside table. I'd like to point out that I'm the real MVP here. Who's the one he scrolls through when he can't sleep? Who's the one he takes everywhere? Who's the one that handles all the awkward silences? Me, that's who. Oh, shut up, said my lamp in a tone so dry it could have started a brush fire. You're nothing but a glorified rectangle. Meanwhile, I'm here lighting up the entire room, and do I get a thank you? No. I just get switched off mid-sentence like I'm some sort of afterthought. At this point, I wasn't even questioning it anymore. I was too busy laughing. A full, chest-shaking laugh that I couldn't suppress even if I wanted to. The absurdity of it all, my personal belongings staging an impromptu roast, was too much to process. Hey, buddy, my pillow said softly, nudging against my ear. Its voice was warm and comforting, like a close friend who knows all your secrets but loves you anyway. Ignore them. You're doing fine. But, could you maybe flip me to the cool side a little more often? Just saying. That was when my socks started arguing with each other about who smelled worse. I let them go at it while I headed to the kitchen. I needed coffee, and I needed it now. The mug I pulled out of the cabinet sighed with relief when I grabbed it. Finally, it said, I've been waiting for my moment. Look at me. Perfect size, sturdy handle, gorgeous glaze. I'm the Beyoncé of mugs, and yet you always pick the chipped one. What's up with that? The coffee maker grumbled to itself as it sputtered to life. All of you shut up, it groaned. You've got it easy. He doesn't kick you awake every morning and expect you to perform miracles. And for what? Lukewarm praise and a caffeine rush? It's thankless work, I tell you. Breakfast was another round of commentary. The toaster refused to pop up my bread until I admitted I liked it better than the microwave. The fridge was offended when I left the door open too long. The egg whisk went on a tirade about how no one respected the artistry of a good scramble anymore. By the time I sat down to eat, I was half convinced that I'd fallen into some kind of enchanted fairy tale where all the household objects had unionized. And the truth was, I didn't hate it. There was something comforting about knowing my things had personalities, even if they were a little snarky. It was like having roommates who couldn't physically leave. I leaned back in my chair, taking it all in. The table creaked beneath me, muttering something about how I needed to lose a few pounds. The chair immediately jumped to my defense. You're doing great, sweetie, it said in an exaggerated mom voice. And that's when it hit me. This was my life now. A house full of opinionated, sentient objects who had absolutely no filter and seemed to know me better than I knew myself. I wasn't sure if it was a blessing or a curse, but it sure as hell wasn't boring. So now I'm wondering, if you had the chance to live in a house like mine, where everything had a voice and no one was shy about sharing their thoughts, would you take it? Or would you pack up and move into a silent, object-free cave. Be honest. I won't tell the furniture. It was the kind of realization that doesn't arrive with a crash but rather with a soft, almost imperceptible tap on the shoulder. I was standing in the cereal aisle of the grocery store, staring at a row of brightly colored boxes that seemed to shout their names at me: Frosty Nuggets, Cinnaswirls, Berry Blast Bombs. Each one promised a slightly different version of happiness, as though the choice between clusters, flakes, or puffs could alter the course of my life. And that's when it hit me. Not the cereal, but the absurdity of the moment. Why was I putting so much thought into something I'd pour milk over and forget about in 5 minutes? More than that, why were there 50 kinds of cereal in the first place? Somewhere in the back of my mind, the thought ballooned into something larger. This is it, isn't it? This is modern life. A series of absurdly specific options masquerading as meaningful decisions. I didn't buy the cereal. Instead, I went home and opened my phone, because apparently, this is what I do when confronted with existential questions about breakfast food. Scrolling my feed, I realized that the world of social media is just another cereal aisle, except here the puffs are memes and the flakes are hot takes. Everyone presenting their personal brand like it's a limited edition flavor. Try me. Now with 30% more snark. Gluten-free optimism with a side of anxiety. I paused on a post of someone's dog wearing a little yellow raincoat. The caption read, "When you just wanted a walk, but now you're modeling for Instagram." It was cute. I double-tapped. And yet, I couldn't help but wonder why I'd spent 5 whole seconds contemplating the inner life of a dog in a raincoat. Here's the thing, though. I didn't stop scrolling. I went deeper, past the raincoat dog, past the motivational quotes written in curly fonts, and past the videos of people doing impossibly specific things, like carving spoons out of wood or cooking elaborate meals on a campfire in the middle of nowhere. One video in particular caught my eye. It was of a woman meticulously organizing her fridge, using acrylic bins to corral apples, color-coded labels for condiments, and tiny glass jars for sauces. The end result looked like something out of a minimalist fever dream. And yet, as I watched, I realized my jaw had gone slack with awe. The level of precision was both inspiring and entirely unnecessary, and for reasons I couldn't quite articulate, I felt seen. When the video ended, I stared at the blank screen for a moment, my reflection faintly visible. It wasn't just the fridge video. It was all of it. The raincoat dog, the memes, the sheer amount of human effort poured into creating little moments of order, humor, or beauty in a world that often feels like it's spiraling in the opposite direction. It was overwhelming, but also strangely comforting. As if, in the face of chaos, we've collectively decided that tiny, perfect moments are our best defense. Later that evening, I found myself rearranging my spice rack. Not because it needed it, mind you, it really didn't, but because I was chasing that same sense of satisfaction I'd seen in the fridge video. As I lined up jars of paprika and cumin, I couldn't help but laugh. Was this who I was now? Someone who finds meaning in alphabetizing turmeric? I thought back to my grandparents, who didn't alphabetize spices because they didn't have 15 of them to alphabetize. If they needed spice, they grew it or traded with the neighbors. Their shelves weren't curated. They were practical, like everything else in their lives. The modern obsession with perfection might have baffled them. Then again, I think about the joy my grandmother used to take in hanging laundry, just so on the line, or the pride my grandfather had in fixing a broken chair instead of throwing it away. Maybe it's not so different. Maybe the details have changed, but the impulse hasn't. We're all just looking for ways to make life feel a little less random. The next day, I got a notification on my phone. Your package has been delivered. I opened the door to find a small cardboard box waiting for me. Inside was a magnetic rack for my spice jars. I had ordered it the night before, after the organizing frenzy. I set it up and stood back, feeling the same irrational pride I imagine a Renaissance artist felt when completing a masterpiece. Was it practical? Absolutely not. Did it spark joy? Unquestionably. As I admired my work, I couldn't help but think about how strange it was that this tiny, unnecessary object had made its way into my life. Somewhere out there, someone designed it, someone else manufactured it, and a whole chain of people transported it from a warehouse to my doorstep. Also, I could stand here and say, Yes, my cumin now has a home. I thought about this later as I made dinner, sprinkling paprika from its new, magnetically displayed jar. The modern world is ridiculous. And yet, it's also full of these tiny, absurd miracles. Sure, we've traded big, sweeping gestures for micro-satisfactions, but maybe that's okay. Maybe the frog chair and the raincoat dog and the acrylic bins are just our way of saying, hey, life is weird, but here's something small to make it better. I don't know if that makes us shallow or resourceful, but I like to think it's the latter. As I sat down to eat, I looked at my plate and laughed. All of it, everything, had been touched by the same invisible system of absurdity and convenience. The food was delivered, the recipes came from Pinterest, and even the plate itself was something I had purchased online after reading too many reviews. It should have made me feel disconnected, but it didn't. It made me feel connected in an entirely different way, like we're all in this together, building tiny, ridiculous systems to make sense of things. So here's my question for you. What's your version of the spice rack? What little thing in today's world makes you smile, even if it's completely absurd? The world had not changed, not really, but I walked through it this morning as though it had. The feeling hit me as soon as I stepped outside, like I'd been nudged off course into some alternate reality where everything looked the same but shimmered faintly at the edges, as if lit from within by something I couldn't quite see. The smell of rain from the night before hung heavy in the air, and the wet pavement reflected the sky back at me in ghostly streaks of gray and white. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm wailed half-heartedly, the kind of sound that no one responds to because it's more nuisance than warning. I could hear it echo through the narrow streets like the city was muttering to itself, as groggy as I felt. There was nothing unusual about the way the morning unfolded, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was on the outside of it, watching everything through a one-way mirror. A neighbor 2 doors down was struggling to fold up an umbrella that had clearly been on its last leg for years. His wife, or at least I assumed it was his wife, stood nearby holding a plastic bag full of something that looked suspiciously like Tupperware leftovers, an expression of long-suffering patience on her face. I imagined a whole story for them in the few seconds it took for me to walk by. He always forgets to replace the broken umbrella. She always nags him about it, and every time it rains, they end up in this little ritual. Maybe they grumble about it to friends later, but secretly, it's their thing. Their tiny, ridiculous way of saying, we're in this together. At the crosswalk, I paused to wait for the light to change. A man in a business suit was standing next to me, holding a coffee cup with a logo I didn't recognize. His tie was just slightly crooked, and there was a faint smudge of ink on the cuff of his shirt. He was staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen like he couldn't decide whether to scroll down or close the app entirely. I wondered what he was reading. Something important, something trivial, something that would shape his day in ways he wouldn't realize until much later. The crosswalk signal turned green, and he didn't notice at first. When I took my first step, he snapped out of his trance and followed, his polished shoes tapping against the wet pavement in sync with mine. It was a small thing, barely worth noting, but it felt like a tiny thread had momentarily connected us. On the corner, a woman was sitting on the steps of a brownstone, her arms wrapped around a large cardboard box. She looked about my age, but there was something ageless about the way she sat, slumped forward, her chin resting on the box as though it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. I caught her eye for a second, and she smiled faintly. Not the kind of smile you give a stranger, but the kind that leaks out when you're too tired to hide it. I smiled back, and then we both turned away at the same time, as if by unspoken agreement. I spent the next block wondering what was in the box. Old books? Clothes? A cat that wouldn't stop yowling in the middle of the night? Whatever it was, she carried it like it weighed 100 pounds, even though it didn't seem heavy at all. When I reached the small park near my office, I decided to cut through it, even though it meant walking on grass that was still damp from the rain. A group of kids were playing tag in the middle of the field, their sneakers leaving faint, muddy imprints that would disappear by afternoon. They were laughing so loudly that it drowned out the sounds of traffic nearby, their voices sharp and bright like shards of glass catching the sunlight. One of them tripped and fell, sprawling face first into the wet grass. For a second, the world seemed to hold its breath, But then he popped back up, grinning, and the others cheered like he'd just scored a goal. I couldn't remember the last time I'd fallen and gotten up that quickly, without hesitation, without embarrassment. At the edge of the park, a man was feeding the pigeons, not just tossing crumbs, but carefully lowering handfuls of seeds to the ground, as if he were negotiating some kind of fragile truce with the birds. They clustered around him, their gray and white bodies shifting like the surface of a restless ocean. Every so often, one would flutter up onto his arm or shoulder, and he didn't seem to mind. I watched him for longer than I meant to, fascinated by the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. It was strange how peaceful it looked. Feeding pigeons is the kind of thing people joke about, something you imagine doing when you're too old for everything else. But in that moment, it didn't look sad or boring. It looked like exactly the right thing to do. By the time I reached my office, I felt like I'd walked through an entire novel. None of it was mine, though. Every moment I'd noticed belonged to someone else. The umbrella couple, the businessman, the woman with the box, the kids, the man with the pigeons. And yet, in a strange way, it felt like all of it belonged to me too, simply because I'd been there to witness it. Like I was collecting pieces of a mosaic without knowing what the final picture would look like. As I sat down at my desk and turned on my computer, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman with the box. I had no reason to. Really. She was just a face in the crowd. Random moment that had already passed. But there was something about her that stuck with me. The way she smiled despite whatever weight she was carrying. The way she seemed so solid and fragile at the same time. I wondered if anyone had ever felt that way about me. Noticed something I hadn't meant to show, turned it over in their mind, carried it with them for a little while before letting it go. So, what about you? What have you seen lately? Something small, something fleeting, something that wasn't meant for you but found its way to you anyway. What moments make you feel like a traveler, passing through a world that's both yours and not yours at the same time? The day I outran the rain felt like the kind of day that only exists between waking and dreaming, where the air hums with a strange sort of inevitability. I didn't plan to leave the house. In fact, the morning had begun in a dull hum of nothingness, the kind of gray haze that usually traps you in place. But then, without much thought, I grabbed my keys and stepped out, as if summoned by some invisible thread pulling me forward. I didn't know where I was going until I found myself at the train station, standing in front of the ticket machine. My hand hovered over the buttons, hesitating. The names of towns I'd never been to stared back at me, unfamiliar yet promising. One stood out, a place I'd never heard of, tucked at the end of the line like an afterthought. The ticket clattered into the tray, and before I could second-guess myself, I was on the platform, watching the train glide in like a secret being whispered. The journey felt surreal, the kind of quiet that grows loud in its absence. The train car was nearly empty, except for a girl with turquoise hair a few rows ahead, humming a tune I couldn't place. She was sketching furiously in a small notebook, her pencil moving like it had its own mind. I wanted to ask her what she was drawing, but the moment felt too fragile to interrupt, so I just watched the landscape outside shift from gray city blocks to open fields brushed with the golden light of a reluctant sun. When I arrived, the station was little more than a platform and a wooden bench, weathered and splintered. No signs, no announcements. It felt like stepping into a place that didn't entirely exist, as if the world had forgotten this little town. I followed a narrow cobblestone path that led away from the station, weaving through houses with ivy-covered walls and shutters painted in mismatched shades of green and blue. The air smelled of wet earth, as if it had rained earlier, though the sky above was a restless quilt of clouds threatening to burst again. The sound of music drew me before anything else did. It wasn't loud, just the faint strains of something old and familiar, though I couldn't name it. The melody floated down the street like a paper boat on water, leading me to a small square where a man sat under an awning, playing a violin. His case lay open at his feet, but it was empty, as if no one had passed through here in ages. I stopped to listen, letting the music settle into me. He didn't acknowledge me, his eyes closed as he played, but somehow, it felt like the song was for me alone. The rain came suddenly, in sharp, fat drops that pelted the cobblestones. The The man didn't stop playing, and I didn't move, letting the rain soak through my jacket and drip from my hair. A laugh bubbled out of me, unbidden, and in that moment, it felt like the rain was part of the music, the melody and rhythm colliding in a way that couldn't be planned. I finally ducked into a small shop when the downpour turned fierce, the bell above the door jangling as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and dried herbs, the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with books, jars, and trinkets that seemed like they had been collected from a dozen different lifetimes. Behind the counter sat a woman with silver streaks in her hair and a look that suggested she already knew everything about me without asking. "You're late," she said, without looking up from the book in her hands. I blinked, unsure how to respond. Late for what? She didn't answer, only gestured toward a corner of the shop where a single book lay on a small wooden table. Unlike the others, it was unmarked, its cover plain and worn like it had been touched by 1,000 hands. I hesitated before picking it up, the weight of it surprising. The pages were blank, but as I flipped through, faint shapes and words began to emerge, like ink seeping through from the other side. "You'll want to hold on to that," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. "It tends to fill itself when the time is right." Before I could ask what she meant, the door swung open, and the turquoise-haired girl from the train stepped inside, shaking rain from her jacket. She glanced at me, her eyes flicking to the book in my hands before a small smile curved her lips. "Guess you found it," she said, as if we'd spoken before. I wanted to ask her what she meant, or why she seemed to know me, but she had already turned to the woman at the counter, slipping her sketchbook from her bag. They spoke in low voices, their words blending with the patter of rain on the windows. I left the shop before I could overthink it, the book tucked under my arm like a secret. The rain had softened to a mist, the world blurred at the edges. The violinist was gone, the square empty except for the echoes of his melody lingering in the air. I wandered for hours, the book in my hands growing heavier with each step, though I didn't open it again. Somehow, it felt like carrying it was enough. By the time I made my way back to the station, the sky had cleared, the clouds giving way to a burnished orange sunset that painted the world in warmth. On the train ride home, I opened the book again. This time, the pages were full, sketches of places I'd never seen, fragments of stories that felt like they belonged to me and yet didn't. At the bottom of one page, in handwriting that wasn't mine, were the words, "Sometimes, you don't find the story finds you." Have you ever had a moment when it felt like the world was unfolding itself just for you? The black dog arrived on a Tuesday. It came with no sound, no warning, just a ripple in the air as though the world itself was exhaling. Ivy first saw it sitting on the hill outside her house, its massive frame silhouetted against the pale sky. The dog was enormous, easily the size of a small horse, but it didn't move like a predator. It simply sat, its dark eyes locked on her kitchen window. She tried ignoring it, turning back to the sink, scrubbing at the stubborn casserole dish with more force than necessary. When she glanced back, it was still there. By the next morning, it was closer. It stood at the edge of her yard, near the row of lilac bushes her grandmother had planted decades ago. Ivy thought about calling someone, the animal control officer. Maybe, though she doubted they had a protocol for shadowy beasts that appeared out of nowhere. She opened her front door, half expecting it to bolt, but the dog didn't flinch. Instead, it lowered itself onto its haunches and tilted its head, watching her with unsettling intensity. There was no malice in its gaze, but there was something else, something ancient and unyielding. "You lost?" Ivy called, her voice wavering despite her attempt at confidence. The dog didn't respond, of course, but it didn't leave either. By the third day, the neighbors had noticed. Mrs. Kaplan from across the street peered through her blinds for hours, her face tight with worry. At the hardware store, old Mr. Bennett muttered something about omens and the old ways, though he refused to elaborate. The teenagers who normally biked up and down Ivy Street had stopped coming altogether. The dog's presence pressed on everyone like a storm about to break. On the fourth day, Ivy had had enough. She grabbed a flashlight and a broom and stepped outside, determined to scare it off. The moment she crossed the threshold, the dog stood, its eyes glowing faintly in the twilight. "Go on," she shouted, waving the broom. "Shoo, you don't belong here." The dog took a single step forward, and Ivy froze. Its movements were deliberate, almost calculated. Then it stopped, just out of reach, and lowered its head. A faint growl rumbled in its chest. Not a threat, but a warning. Ivy stumbled back inside and slammed the door. That night, she dreamed of fire. It wasn't the first time. For months, the dreams had come and gone, flickering fragments of burning buildings and scorched earth. Sometimes she saw faces in the flames, their mouths moving in silent screams. Other times, she was alone, standing in the center of the inferno as the heat licked at her skin. When she woke, she wasn't surprised to see the dog sitting outside her window, staring at her as if it knew. On the 5th day, Ivy decided to test her limits. She filled a bowl with water and placed it on the porch. The dog approached slowly, its massive paws silent against the wood. Up close, it was even larger than she'd thought, its fur blacker than any natural shadow. It sniffed the bowl, then looked up at her. "You're not really a dog, are you?" she whispered. The animal didn't move. Then, as if answering her question, it lapped at the water with slow, deliberate strokes. By the 6th day, Ivy started noticing changes. The lilacs bloomed out of season, their scent heavier than she remembered. The wind carried whispers, faint and indistinct but unmistakably real. And at night, the fire dreams grew clearer. In one dream, she saw herself standing on a cliff, the black dog at her side. Below her, a city burned, its streets crawling with figures she couldn't quite see. The dog's voice was in her head, deep and resonant. "You called us." When she woke, the words lingered like an ache in her chest. She didn't remember calling anyone, or anything, but the dog's arrival had stirred something inside her, something she couldn't name. On the 7th day, the dog spoke. Not with words. It didn't need them. The connection between them had grown taut, like a thread pulling tighter with every moment. Ivy stood in her yard, the cool morning air prickling her skin, and the dog simply looked at her. "It's time." Her legs moved without permission, carrying her to the hill where she'd first seen it. The dog walked beside her, its stride perfectly matched to hers. As they climbed, the whispers grew louder, coalescing into a steady hum that thrummed in her bones. At the top of the hill, the air shimmered. The dog stopped and turned to face her, its eyes burning with an intensity that made her want to look away but couldn't. "What are you?" she asked. "The question is not what I am," it replied, the voice filling her head, "but what you are." The ground beneath her shifted, and the world tilted. Images flooded her mind. Ancient forests, endless seas, skies split by lightning. A history that wasn't hers, but somehow felt like it was. She saw a girl standing at the edge of a fire, her hands raised as flames danced around her. She saw a dog, this dog, guarding the girl, its presence both a shield and a burden. And she understood. The black dog was no omen. It was a herald, a guardian, a reminder of what she had been and what she could be again. The air grew still, the whispers fading into silence. Ivy reached out, her fingers brushing the dog's fur. It was warm, alive, and thrumming with power. "Why me?" she whispered. The dog tilted its head, the faintest hint of a smile in its gaze. "Because you remember." I think about it sometimes, how certain moments in life seem so ordinary when you're in them, and yet, years later, they become these tiny treasures you tuck away in the corners of your mind, pulling them out when you need something to warm your heart. There's one memory that always gets me. I couldn't have been older than 10 or 11, and it was a summer afternoon that stretched on forever, as summer days seem to when you're young. The air outside was heavy with heat, but inside, the living room was cool. The blinds pulled down just enough to cast stripes of golden light across the carpet. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of the TV, a stack of worn VHS tapes next to me, their labels peeling off from being handled too much. I remember how serious the process felt, flipping through the tapes like they were some ancient artifacts that needed to be treated with reverence. Each one was its own little promise of adventure. I'd end up picking the same one I always did, The Land Before Time. Or maybe The Never-Ending Story, the kind of movie where the whole world felt bigger, brighter, and a little magical. I still remember the soft hum of the VCR as it swallowed the tape, the way the static on the screen would flicker for a moment before the movie started, like it was a portal into another world. I can still hear the sound of the opening music, feel the soft polyester of the couch beneath my fingertips as I leaned back, a bowl of overly salty popcorn balanced precariously on my knees. Some days, my best friend Katie would be there too, sprawled out on the carpet beside me, her hair in a mess of sun-bleached tangles. We'd quote the lines as they came, half whispering, half laughing, even though we knew the entire script by heart. There was this comfort in knowing exactly what was going to happen, in the predictability of it all, like the world inside that movie was safe and unchanging, no matter what was going on outside. Katie always cried at the same parts, and I used to tease her about it. But the truth was, I cried too. I just got better at hiding it. After the movie, we'd run outside, barefoot on the warm concrete, the smell of freshly cut grass hanging in the air. Our neighborhood was one of those places where kids just showed up at each other's houses unannounced. No texts or calls, just bikes dumped on lawns and screen doors slamming. We'd grab popsicles from someone's freezer, racing each other to finish before they melted, tongues stained bright red or purple. Someone always had a soccer ball or a frisbee, and the game didn't matter so much as the laughter, the easy rhythm of it all. There was a patch of woods behind Katie's house that felt like our own secret kingdom, a place where we were pirates or explorers or whatever else we decided to be that day. I think about the little things too, the ones that didn't seem important at the time. Like the way my mom always had a pitcher of Kool-Aid in the fridge, the kind with so much sugar it made your teeth ache. Or the way my dad would sit on the porch in the evenings, the old radio playing some scratchy station while he whittled away at a piece of wood, shavings piling up at his feet. I never paid much attention to what he was carving, but now I wish I had. I wonder if he remembers those moments the way I do, or if they were just part of the background for him, like white noise. There's something about those old cell phones too, the ones that flipped open with a satisfying click, back when text messages had character limits and every letter took 3 button presses. I think of how my older sister used to spend hours composing texts to her crush, her face glowing with the pale blue light of the screen as she chewed on the end of her pencil. I wasn't supposed to know about it, of course, but I always did. There was a kind of thrill to it, the way she'd let me in on her secrets sometimes, whispering details in hushed tones when our parents weren't listening. And oh, the music. There was always music. We had this beat-up old stereo in the kitchen that played everything from Britney Spears to the Backstreet Boys, and I remember dancing around with my little brother, using wooden spoons as microphones while my mom laughed at us from the sink. He was so small back then, his hair sticking up in every direction, his giggles bouncing off the walls. It didn't matter how off-key we were or how ridiculous we looked. It felt like the whole world was cheering us on. Sometimes I think about the way the light used to look in the late afternoons, when the sun would dip low and everything turned golden. The shadows would stretch long across the yard, and the cicadas would start their endless hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around us. We'd stay outside until the streetlights flickered on, the signal that it was time to head home. Even then, we'd linger, dragging our feet as if holding on to the last bits of daylight could somehow make it last forever. I don't know when those days stopped, when the magic of it all faded into something more ordinary. I guess it happened slowly, the way things always do, slipping through your fingers before you even realize you're holding them. Katie moved away, the woods got replaced by a row of cookie-cutter houses, and the VCR finally broke down for good. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see it all so clearly, like I'm stepping back into a photograph that somehow moves and breathes. It's a funny thing, memory. It doesn't just take you back. It wraps you up, makes you feel like you're there again, even if only for a moment. I don't feel sad when I think about those times. Not really. If anything, it's like finding an old sweater at the back of your closet, one you forgot you had. You pull it on, and it's warm and familiar, and for a little while, it feels like coming home. So I guess I'm curious now. What little thing from the past always brings a smile to your face when you remember it? I was walking home last Thursday, headphones in, mindlessly scrolling through my phone as I waited for the light to change at the crosswalk. The air was crisp, the kind that whispers that winter is close but hasn't quite taken hold yet. I remember standing there, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, when I heard it. It wasn't particularly loud, just faint enough to make me pause. Someone on the other side of the street had their car windows rolled down, and from their speakers spilled a song I hadn't heard in over 15 years. It wasn't anything wildly profound, just some bubblegum pop hit from the late 90s that had no business being stuck so deep in my subconscious. Yet there it was, and it was all I could hear. I froze, not even realizing the light had turned green until someone behind me cleared their throat in irritation. My feet carried me forward, but my head was gone, completely untethered from the present. That song had been the anthem of my 5th grade summer. I could feel it all so vividly again. The cheap plastic feel of my Walkman in my hands, the way the headphones always pressed just a little too hard on my ears, but I didn't care because I was that kid who carried her music everywhere. I remembered the hours spent lying on the carpeted floor of my best friend's basement, both of us making these terribly uncoordinated choreography routines to the songs on repeat. The way the air in her basement was always just a bit musty from the old furniture, but it had this comforting warmth that felt like a hug after long days spent running barefoot through the neighborhood. I could see it all like I was there again. The bright neon posters on her walls, covered with magazine cutouts of boy bands we swore we'd marry someday. The glitter gel pens scattered across the table because we'd get distracted doodling lyrics in notebooks instead of actually practicing our dance moves. There was this stupid game we'd play where we'd close our eyes and take turns rewinding the cassette tape just far enough to try and hit the perfect spot at the beginning of a song. We'd always overshoot or undershoot it, and every time, without fail, we'd end up laughing so hard we could barely breathe. I hadn't thought about that summer in years, and yet one stupid pop song blaring from a stranger's car window yanked me back like it had been waiting for the right moment all along. I barely registered the walk home, but when I stepped inside my apartment, something compelled me to dig through the back of my closet. It's one of those closets that eats everything. It's basically a black hole where old memories go to die until you decide to pull them out again. And sure enough, there it was, shoved behind some old winter coats and a half-broken suitcase. A cardboard box I hadn't opened since I moved in 3 years ago. I hauled it out, knelt down on the floor, and peeled the lid back like it was some long-lost treasure chest. On top of a bunch of old notebooks and knickknacks sat my old Walkman. It looked smaller than I remembered, and the plastic had yellowed a bit with age. I popped it open, almost afraid it wouldn't work anymore, and sure enough, there was still a tape inside. I turned it over in my hands, an unmarked, black cassette that could have been anything, but I already knew what it was. That mixtape, the one we made after hours of painstakingly recording songs off the radio and cutting out commercials as quickly as possible. I sat there for a good 10 minutes before I even tried to play it. The batteries, to my surprise, hadn't corroded. I slipped on the old headphones, pressed play, and there it was again. The first few scratchy notes hit, and the sound wasn't perfect anymore. It wobbled a bit, and the tape made that familiar faint clicking sound as it rolled, but it was alive. That whole night was a blur of memories. I listened to every song on that tape, and each one felt like a Polaroid snapping into focus in my mind. The warm glow of summer nights, the sound of cicadas humming in the distance, the sticky popsicle juice dripping down my wrist as we sat on the curb and talked about the things kids talk about when they don't yet know how fleeting childhood is. I thought about how we'd sit out there and dream about what it would be like to grow up. At the time, it felt like adulthood was this distant star, untouchable but shining with all its possibilities. We thought life would be endless sleepovers and sugar highs, with maybe a side of being allowed to eat dessert for dinner whenever we wanted. The last track on the tape was our favorite, the one we always saved for our most ridiculous, over-the-top dance moves. I couldn't help myself. I stood up in my living room and tried to remember the routine we'd spent hours perfecting. My arms flailed more than flowed, and my knees popped in protest, but I didn't care. I danced until I couldn't anymore, and when I finally flopped back onto the couch, sweaty and laughing, I felt something I hadn't in years, weightless. It was like for a few moments, the crushing obligations and uncertainties of adulthood melted away, leaving me with nothing but that silly, golden memory of a time when the world felt endless. The tape clicked off eventually, and I was left sitting there, staring at it in my hands. It hit me all at once how strange it is, the things that survive. Most of my memories from that summer had faded into vague, happy blurs, but this stupid little cassette had survived moves, decluttering sprees, and years of neglect. And yet, it still worked. Still carried all that joy and possibility. I put the Walkman back in the box eventually, but not before I left it sitting out for a while, just to look at it, to remember. It's funny, isn't it? How the smallest things, like a song, a smell, or even an old tape you haven't seen in years, can hit you like a wave and bring everything rushing back. What small, randomly found things bring you a moment of calm nostalgia? I met Alex on my first day at a new job, and my immediate thought was, wow, this guy has the personality of a damp sock. He didn't even look up when I introduced myself, just gave a curt nod, mumbled something I assumed was his name, and went back to typing furiously on his keyboard. He wore these plain button-up shirts every day, always tucked in too neatly, with zero sense of humor in his expression. The kind of guy you'd picture keeping spreadsheets for fun, or spending weekends reorganizing his garage. My brain immediately filed him under serious, boring coworker I'll tolerate but never bond with. To make it worse, he had this habit of tapping his pen on his desk when he was thinking, which I could hear from across the office. It drove me absolutely insane. I started bringing noise-canceling headphones just to survive his pen-tapping tyranny. For the first few weeks, I actively avoided him, not out of spite, but because I thought we were just too different to ever click. Our office was open-plan, but there were enough cubicles and random plants that I could strategically pick routes to the kitchen or conference rooms that bypassed his desk entirely. When we were in meetings together, I'd sit as far away as possible, and when he spoke, always in this calm, measured tone, I'd zone out. I was convinced Alex was one of those people who lived their entire life in bullet points. Then came the fire drill. Well, technically, it wasn't a real fire drill. It was the sandwich toaster in the break room catching fire because someone, okay, fine, it was me, forgot to clean out the crumbs. The alarms went off, chaos ensued, and I ran out of the building clutching my phone and an uncapped Sharpie for reasons I still can't explain. I ended up standing in the parking lot, face burning with embarrassment, when Alex walked over. For the first time, I got a real look at him. He was tall, but somehow I'd never noticed how lanky he was, like he hadn't quite grown into his limbs. His hair was slightly messy, and he had this weird half-smile, like he found the whole situation mildly entertaining. "I'm guessing it was you," he said, nodding toward the building. "What makes you think that?" I shot back, trying to sound innocent but probably failing miserably. "You're holding a Sharpie like it's a weapon." He said it so deadpan that I couldn't tell if he was joking or accusing me. For a second, I panicked. Then, without thinking, I blurted, "It's for signing autographs. I'm a hero now. Save the office from a rogue toaster." He actually laughed, like a full-on laugh that caught me so off guard I almost dropped my Sharpie. It wasn't one of those polite chuckles people give to fill awkward silences. It was real and warm, and it transformed his whole face. His laugh lines crinkled in this ridiculously charming way, and for the first time, I noticed his eyes weren't just brown. They were the kind of brown that glowed like amber in sunlight. After that, Alex somehow became human. Like, I started to notice these tiny little quirks about him that made him way more interesting than I'd given him credit for. He was the first person in the office every morning, but not because he was a workaholic. Turns out, he liked to spend the first hour of his day sipping coffee and sketching in this old leather notebook he kept tucked in his desk drawer. I only discovered that by accident when I arrived early one morning to prep for a presentation and saw him bent over his desk, doodling these intricate little cartoons of our coworkers. He didn't notice me, so I lingered at a distance, watching as he sketched the boss as some kind of dragon in a suit. When I finally made a noise, he jumped about a foot in the air, slammed the notebook shut, and stammered something about just killing time. From that day on, I made it my mission to crack him open like a safe. I dropped by his desk with ridiculous questions just to see if I could make him laugh. "Hey, Alex, if you were a fruit, what fruit would you be?" Or, Do you think pigeons ever feel existential dread? At first, he'd just give me this puzzled look, like he couldn't decide if I was joking or genuinely insane. But slowly, he started playing along. One day, I found a sticky note on my monitor that said, "Pineapple, prickly on the outside, sweet on the inside." Another time, I caught him quietly sliding a cartoon of an existentially sad pigeon onto my desk during a particularly boring meeting. The turning point, the moment I realized I was definitely falling for him, came during the company holiday party. Everyone else was drunk and shouting over each other, but Alex and I ended up in the corner, talking about the books we loved as kids. I found out he was a total science fiction nerd, and he got really animated describing this one obscure series he'd read a dozen times. At some point, I said something self-deprecating, probably about how I'd read trashy romance novels in high school, and he gave me this look, like he was genuinely confused about why I'd ever put myself down. Then he said, "You know, I think the things people love, no matter how silly they seem, say a lot about who they are. And I think you're probably more interesting than you give yourself credit for." I didn't know what to say, so I just stared at him, wondering how I'd ever thought this guy was boring. We started dating a few months later, though we kept it quiet at work. Now, whenever I hear someone tapping a pen, instead of getting annoyed, I feel this stupid, giddy warmth. We still have our differences. He's all logic and planning, and I'm the queen of chaos, but it works. If anything, I think we balance each other out. Have you ever been totally wrong about someone at first? I woke up to the sound of my alarm clock arguing with my bedside lamp. The clock's digital face blinked furiously as it spat out the words, "I've been doing all the heavy lifting for years, and for what? You just stand there looking shiny. What's your purpose? Mood lighting? Please." The lamp, a tall and elegant thing with a smug curve to its shade, flared on and off like it was scoffing. "At least I'm aesthetically pleasing. You're an outdated hunk of plastic with an inferiority complex." I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and stared at the scene. My furniture was having a domestic spat. At first, I thought it was a dream, the kind where you laugh at the absurdity and move on. But then my blanket chimed in, wrapping around my ankle and saying in a deep, cozy voice, "Don't get up yet. It's so warm here. Why ruin this?" That was the moment I realized something bigger was at play. Everything in my house could talk, and not just talk, they had opinions. Strong ones. About me. About each other. About everything. When I finally managed to extract myself from the blanket's clingy grip and swing my feet onto the floor, my slippers grumbled. "Oh, look who finally decided to grace us with their presence," one slipper muttered, while the other sighed, "We've been waiting for weeks to feel appreciated, and here you come, stomping around like you own the place." I apologized to the slippers, feeling absurd but strangely compelled to make amends. "You don't even know how hard we work," they added, as I shuffled my way to the bathroom. The bathroom mirror was not kind. As soon as I flicked on the light, it gasped dramatically. "Oh dear. Oh my. Have you seen yourself? That hair. Those dark circles. What did you do last night, wrestle raccoons?" I frowned, trying to smooth my hair down with my fingers, but the mirror wouldn't let up. "That's not helping. Get some water on it or something. Honestly, how do you expect me to reflect this mess all day?" The sink groaned at the mention of water. "Don't listen to him. He's vain. He doesn't know what it's like to have pipes clogged with toothpaste and soap residue. I'm the one who has to deal with the consequences of your morning routine." The shower, on the other hand, was thrilled when I turned it on. "Ah, yes, there it is. Warm water. My raison d'etre. Sing, my friend, sing. Let's make this a concert." It was hard not to laugh as the showerhead belted out a hilariously off-key version of Bohemian Rhapsody while I scrubbed shampoo into my hair. The loofah joined in with backup vocals, and the soap dish offered gentle criticism about pitch and tempo. By the time I stepped out, the entire bathroom was in high spirits, even the cranky mirror, who begrudgingly admitted, "You do clean up well. Fine, I'll allow it." Breakfast was a circus. The toaster was bossy. Bagels only. I swear to all that is holy, if you put a waffle in me one more time. The coffee maker was overly dramatic, hissing steam like a dragon guarding its hoard. The fridge refused to open at first, grumbling about being overworked and underappreciated, but eventually relented when I pointed out that it literally had one job. "Fine," it said with a frosty sigh, "but only because I'm in a good mood today." The eggs in the carton gave me a pep talk while I cracked them into the frying pan, telling me I was destined for greatness. "Scramble us well," they said. "We believe in you." As the day went on, I discovered that everything had something to say. My phone was a chatterbox, constantly buzzing with updates like, "You've been ignoring your emails for 3 days. Do you want to be that person? The one who ghosts their inbox." My couch was a diva, demanding better pillows. These are decorative. I need lumbar support, darling. My cushions are crying for help. Even the vacuum cleaner, a generally stoic machine, grunted. "You really let it go this week, huh? What is this, a crumb graveyard?" I should have been overwhelmed. Any normal person would have been. But instead, I felt entertained. How could I not? Every interaction was a tiny performance, a snippet of personality I didn't know existed in the inanimate world. My bookshelf was a philosopher, waxing poetic about the meaning of literature. Ah, to hold knowledge in your hands, to cradle the universe within these pages. But do you ever finish what you start? My plants were gossips, whispering to each other about who was getting the most sunlight. The spider plant in the corner was particularly sassy. "Look at Fern over there, hogging the prime real estate. Some of us are out here struggling, Susan." By the time evening rolled around, I'd settled into the chaos like it was the most natural thing in the world. I sat on my couch, which had finally been placated with a pillow from my bed, and sipped tea while my mug hummed a soft, content tune. The TV remote, usually silent and utilitarian, suggested we watch a documentary. "Something about space," it said. "You need to expand your horizons." The TV groaned when I flipped to a baking show instead, but begrudgingly complied. "Fine," it muttered. "Pastries it is." As I drifted off to sleep, my blanket wrapped around me once again and whispered, "You're a strange one, but we like you." The pillow beneath my head sighed softly, as if to say, "Good night." And just before I closed my eyes, I thought about how much more lively the world had become. I couldn't imagine going back to the silence of before. How did I ever live without knowing my coat rack thought I was terrible at hanging things properly? So now I'm curious. If you woke up in a world like this, where your belongings had minds of their own, what do you think your favorite object would say about you? Would they be kind? Judgmental? Or would they just roast you like my toaster does? I woke up to the sound of whispering, not the soft mumble of someone in another room, not the faint chatter of a radio left on somewhere. No, this was a kind of whispering I'd never heard before. High-pitched, frantic, and oddly rhythmic, like tiny people were trying to organize a protest in my bedroom. I squinted against the morning light and turned my head toward the noise. That's when I saw it. My alarm clock was arguing with my nightstand. "Don't you dare act like you're more important than me," the clock hissed in a voice so sharp it could have cut glass. "I have a literal job. What do you do? Hold things. Congratulations, you're a glorified shelf." The nightstand retaliated in a voice that was deep, calm, and laced with sarcasm. "And yet, without me, you'd be on the floor. Tick away on the carpet, genius." I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and sat up. Surely, I was still dreaming. But no, the moment I moved, the mattress groaned loudly, like an old man whose knees had just given out. "Oh great, Sleeping Beauty's up," the mattress grumbled. "Another day of being squished to death by your questionable posture. Do you even know what lumbar support is? Because I sure don't." I stared at it, unsure of how to respond. The pillow took this as its cue to jump in. "He's fine. Leave him alone," it said in a voice that was unnervingly maternal. "He's got a big head. Can you blame him for needing a little extra fluff? You try holding that thing up for 8 hours straight." I should have been freaking out, screaming, running out of the house. Instead, I just sat there, mildly amused and more than a little intrigued. My alarm clock and nightstand were mid-argument again, this time roping the lamp into their dispute. "Oh, don't drag me into this," The lamp said in a tone that could only be described as posh. "I'm above your petty squabbles. Literally. I have a lampshade and everything." It was official. My furniture had become sentient, and not only that, they were gossipy. When I went to brush my teeth, the bathroom was no better. The sink was dramatically complaining about how the faucet kept stealing all the glory, while it had to deal with everyone's spit and toothpaste. "Nobody respects a good basin anymore," it sighed wistfully. Meanwhile, the toothbrush and toothpaste were locked in a passive-aggressive Cold War. "She only squeezes me from the middle," the toothpaste muttered as I picked it up. "Do you know how dehumanizing that is?" "Oh, cry me a river," the toothbrush snapped back. "At least you don't have to go inside his mouth. You think you're the victim? Try being jammed into molars every morning." I started laughing. Not just a polite chuckle, but the kind of laugh that bubbles up uncontrollably when life takes a left turn so bizarre that you can't even process it properly. The shower joined in, humming a little ditty in the background. I call it shower serenade, it told me when I paused to listen. It's a work in progress. I'm open to feedback, but only if it's constructive. Things got weirder when I ventured into the kitchen. The fridge greeted me warmly, though it sounded a little smug. "Ah, finally. I'm the real MVP around here, don't you think? Keeping your food fresh, your drinks cold. Honestly, I deserve a raise." "You're insufferable," muttered the microwave. "Big, loud, and always full of mystery stains. You think you're better than me? I heat things up in seconds. The toaster popped in, literally and figuratively. "Can we all just agree that bread is the superior food?" it chirped. "I mean, honestly, what's better than toast? Nothing, that's what. I'm the real star of this kitchen." By lunchtime, I had gotten so used to the chatter that I barely blinked when the stove started offering unsolicited cooking advice. "Turn the burner down," it said in an authoritative tone. "You're gonna scorch the pan. Do you want to ruin your eggs? No? Then listen to me. I'm the expert here." It wasn't until I sat down with my sandwich that I noticed the couch. "Oh, sure," it said as I sank into it. "You lounge on me all day, but do I ever get a thank you? A little appreciation for supporting you through every Netflix binge and existential crisis? No, I'm just here, catching crumbs and collecting lint like some kind of peasant." The coffee table chimed in, its tone dripping with superiority. "At least you get to be soft. Do you know how hard it is to be hardwood? Every scratch, every ring from an uncoastered drink. It's a personal attack, I'll have you know." I sat there, chewing my sandwich, nodding along to the furniture's grievances like this was the most normal thing in the world. At this point, I'd started having fun with it. "Hey, TV," I said out loud, not entirely sure if it could hear me. "Got anything to say?" "Only that your taste in shows is questionable at best," it replied, its screen flickering slightly. "Seriously, another rewatch of The Office? You know there are other shows, right?" By the time the sun started setting, I'd heard my bed sigh dramatically, my doormat lament its life as a glorified dirt catcher, and my car keys grumble about how they were always getting lost, for no good reason. But you know what? I didn't hate it. In fact, I kind of loved it. My house, my belongings, they all had personalities now, quirks, voices. It was like I'd inherited an eccentric family of objects that had just been dying to talk all these years. And maybe, just maybe, I needed this. Sure, they bickered constantly and seemed a little high maintenance, but they also made me laugh. They gave me something to come home to, even if it was just my shoes complaining about how I never cleaned them properly. It was weirdly comforting. So now I'm curious. If you woke up one day and found yourself in a world like mine, where your things could talk and had opinions about everything, would you enjoy it? Or would you find it overwhelming? Let me know, because personally, I think I could get used to this. Maybe even make a sitcom out of it. It was a Wednesday, one of those indistinct, middle-of-the-week days that usually sinks into the background of memory without making much of a splash. I had nothing planned, no obligations to keep me tethered to the clock. My apartment was stiflingly quiet, and a rare January sun spilled through the blinds, warming the dusty air. Something about it made sitting still unbearable, like the sunlight itself was nudging me to get up and go somewhere, anywhere. Without thinking too hard, I grabbed my coat and headed out. I didn't even bother with my phone or wallet. Just my house keys jingling like a half-hearted reminder to be responsible. There's a bookstore in my neighborhood that I always passed but never went into. A narrow little place wedged between a florist and an antique shop. The sign above the door read, "1,000 Lives," in chipped gold paint, and the front window was cluttered with teetering stacks of books and a string of half-working fairy lights. For no real reason at all, that's where I ended up. Inside, the air was a little dusty and a lot cozy, with the faint smell of old pages mingling with lavender from a candle burning on the counter. It was empty except for a gray cat sprawled across a pile of National Geographics and a woman with reading glasses perched at the edge of her nose who didn't even look up when I came in. I wasn't really looking for anything specific, so I let my fingers trail across the spines of books as I wandered. Some titles were familiar, some not. Every now and then, I'd pull one off the shelf and flip through it, catching snippets of someone else's life, someone else's imagination. At the back of the shop, in a dimly lit corner that seemed almost forgotten, I found a leather-bound book with no title, no author, just a strange symbol embossed on the cover in gold. I couldn't resist picking it up. It practically demanded it. The pages were blank, every single one, just smooth, creamy paper that smelled faintly of cedar and ink. A part of me wondered if I was supposed to write in it, but something about it didn't feel like a journal. It felt like it already had a story, one I couldn't quite see. I carried it to the counter anyway, fully expecting the woman to tell me it wasn't for sale or that it was some kind of decorative prop. Instead, she barely glanced at it, rang it up for $5, and handed it back to me in a paper bag. I left the bookstore and started walking without any real direction, the blank book tucked under my arm. I should have gone home. It was getting colder, and the sunlight was starting to fade, but I kept moving, letting the rhythm of my footsteps guide me. That's when I noticed the sound of music. It wasn't loud, more like a whisper of melody carried on the breeze, but it was enough to pull me toward it. I followed the sound to a small park tucked behind a row of old buildings, the kind of place you'd only find by accident. There was a man sitting on a bench, playing a violin with a skill so effortless it didn't seem entirely real. The music was hauntingly beautiful, the kind that makes you feel like you're hearing something ancient, something that's always been there but you've never noticed before. I sat on a nearby bench, the book still in my hands, and listened. He didn't seem to mind the audience, or maybe he didn't notice me at all. When he finally finished, he lowered the violin and looked right at me, his expression unreadable. "That book," he said, his voice low and warm, "isn't empty. You just have to know where to open it." I didn't know how to respond, so I just stared at him. He smiled, stood up, and walked away, disappearing down a cobblestone path that I could have sworn hadn't been there a moment ago. I opened the book again, half expecting to see words where there hadn't been any before, but the pages were still blank. A breeze stirred the air, and a single leaf fell onto the open book, landing perfectly in the center of the page. I picked it up and noticed something odd. It wasn't a leaf from any of the trees in the park. It was golden, not yellow or brown, but actual metallic gold, and the veins running through it seemed to shimmer and shift like tiny rivers of light. Beneath where the leaf had landed, the paper seemed to ripple, and suddenly there were words, faint but legible. They weren't in English. They weren't in any language I recognized, but as I traced the lines with my fingers, I somehow understood them. They told the beginning of a story about a traveler who carried a blank book through a series of extraordinary places, each one more impossible than the last. The traveler was searching for something, though it wasn't clear what. The words stopped abruptly, as if waiting for me to write the next part. I didn't have a pen, but when I touched the page, the words appeared anyway, as if my thoughts were spilling straight onto the paper. I don't remember what I wrote. I just remember the feeling, like I was unlocking something that had been waiting for me all along. When I looked up, the park was different. The trees were taller, their branches arching like cathedral ceilings, and the sky above them was no longer gray but a deep, endless blue shot through with streaks of silver. The air felt alive, humming softly, and the path in front of me seemed to glow faintly, beckoning. I don't know how long I stayed there, wandering through that strange, beautiful place, writing in the book whenever I felt compelled to. I met people, if you could call them people, who spoke in riddles and moved like shadows. I saw things that shouldn't exist, things I can't even describe because the words for them don't exist. When I finally closed the book, I was back in the park, the ordinary one with the bare trees and the cracked sidewalks. The sun was gone, and the street lights had flickered on. The golden leaf was still in my hand, and the book was still warm, as if it had a pulse. I don't know what any of it meant, and maybe I never will. But I can't shake the feeling that the world is bigger than I thought, stranger and more connected in ways I can't begin to understand. The book is still on my shelf, blank again but heavier somehow, like it's full of secrets just waiting to be uncovered. Have you ever had a day that felt like it was straight out of a storybook or an old movie? In the dim light of the grocery store aisle, Mia reached for the last jar of marinara sauce. Her fingertips brushed the glass just as another hand shot out, colliding gently with hers. She looked up, startled, into the warm hazel eyes of a man who immediately withdrew his hand with a sheepish grin. "Sorry," he said, stepping back and raising his palms. "Didn't mean to invade your marinara mission." She chuckled softly, clutching the jar. "It's fine. Marinara diplomacy doesn't require an apology." The man tilted his head, considering her. "If it's a peace treaty you're offering, I might need a pen to sign." The exchange felt easy, almost rehearsed, yet entirely spontaneous. As they stood in the aisle, surrounded by rows of neatly stocked canned goods, the world seemed to shrink, centering on this moment. He introduced himself, Luke, and with surprising nonchalance, remarked on how difficult it was to find decent pasta sauce that wasn't loaded with sugar. Mia found herself laughing, the sound unexpected even to her. She didn't intend to linger, but the conversation meandered. They spoke of recipes and ruined dinners, of spices that defied logic and childhood meals that defined comfort. By the time Mia glanced at her watch, minutes had evaporated like steam over boiling water. "Well," she began, shifting her weight, "I should finish my shopping." Luke nodded but didn't press further. Instead, he stepped aside, a gesture of both respect and reluctance. "It was nice chatting, Mia. I'll see you around." She smiled at the faint hope in his voice, but didn't answer outright. Instead, she pushed her cart forward, her thoughts unusually light. Weeks later, as she unpacked her groceries, Mia came across a jar of marinara. Her lips curled upward as she remembered the encounter. But memory, fickle as it is, was merely a flicker. She placed the jar on the counter, dismissing the moment as an oddity in her otherwise predictable life. That evening, as rain drummed softly against her windows, Mia's phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then opened the message. "Hi, Mia. I wasn't sure if this would work, but I saw your name on the customer feedback card you filled out at the grocery store. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation that day. I hope this isn't too forward." Luke. Her pulse quickened. She should have felt violated. This man had tracked her down. Yet, the message lacked the aggressive certainty she'd come to associate with unwanted advances. It felt tentative, human. And so, against her usual instinct, she replied, "Hey Luke. Unexpected but not unwelcome. What made you go through all that effort?" What followed was an exchange of texts that blurred the boundaries of night and day. Their conversations ranged from the mundane to the deeply personal. They spoke of fears and dreams, of places visited and those they longed to see. As the weeks unfolded, their connection deepened. A delicate thread woven tighter with each shared word. But not all threads hold. One evening, during a casual dinner at a cozy Italian bistro, Mia caught Luke's gaze drifting. It wasn't the wandering eyes of disinterest, but rather a quiet tension, a hesitance she couldn't quite name. "Everything okay?" she asked, setting her fork down. He hesitated, then sighed. "I need to tell you something." The air between them thickened. Mia straightened, bracing herself for a confession she hadn't expected but somehow feared. Luke leaned forward, his expression earnest, almost pained. "I didn't just stumble on your name at the grocery store," he admitted. "I overheard you talking to the cashier. You mentioned an art class you were taking and I found it online and signed up." The revelation struck her like a cold wind. Mia's expression faltered, a mixture of disbelief and something darker. You followed me? I know how it sounds, Luke interjected quickly, his hands raised defensively. But I wasn't stalking you. I didn't know how else to see you again. You were different. I'm sorry if it feels wrong. I thought maybe, if I was honest now, you'd understand. Mia leaned back, her mind racing. The ease of their connection now felt tainted, a script rewritten by a motive she hadn't known. Yet, as she studied him, his open posture, his eyes searching hers for forgiveness, she found herself grappling with a question she hadn't anticipated. Was intent more important than action? The night ended without resolution. They parted ways, Luke's hope visibly diminished. Mia walked home under a moonlit sky, her thoughts tangled in knots she couldn't untie. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between them stretched, heavy and unresolved. Mia wrestled with her feelings, torn between the genuineness of their bond and the unsettling way it had begun. She replayed their moments together, each memory colored by her new understanding. One evening, as she sat by her window, staring out at the city's restless glow, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Luke. Short, simple. I meant every word I said to you, but I understand if you need space. Take care, Mia. The message lingered in her mind, a quiet echo. Trust, she realized, wasn't rebuilt overnight. But something about Luke's vulnerability had burrowed into her heart, a stubborn root refusing to be severed. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she let the night swallow her hesitation, the city lights blurring as she contemplated a truth she couldn't ignore. Even the most flawed beginnings could lead to something unexpectedly beautiful. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was one of them. I left my apartment that Saturday morning with exactly one mission: get coffee. The plan was to shuffle 3 blocks to my favorite corner cafe, order my usual, and spend the day planted on the couch with zero interruptions. It was a gray, drizzly kind of day, perfect for being cozy and doing nothing. I almost didn't go at all, honestly. I had half a mind to settle for the sad, instant coffee hiding in the back of my pantry, but something about the stillness outside felt inviting. So, I pulled on a hoodie, slipped on some sneakers, and ventured out into the misty quiet. Halfway to the cafe, I realized I'd forgotten my headphones. Usually, I'd curse myself for such a rookie mistake, but the absence of music or podcasts made the world sound sharper, like I was suddenly in high definition. The faint splatter of rain on rooftops, the occasional splash of tires through puddles, the far-off laugh of someone unseen. It all felt alive, like the city was awake and stretching itself out after a long night. I took a longer route just to soak it in. When I turned down an alley I don't usually bother with, one of those graffitied shortcuts people only take if they're running late, I saw her. A little girl in a bright yellow raincoat, no older than 7, crouched next to what looked like an enormous cardboard box. She didn't seem lost or scared, just entirely focused on the box. I slowed down, partly out of curiosity and partly because, well, you don't see kids alone in alleys every day. Hey, are you okay? I asked, my voice hesitant but warm. She looked up, startled, then smiled like I was the exact person she'd been waiting for. Do you like treasure? She asked, her voice bubbly but conspiratorial. Now, I'd like to think I'm not the kind of adult who dismisses a kid's imagination outright, so I played along. I love treasure, I said. She grinned wider, stood up, and beckoned me over to the box. Inside, there wasn't gold or jewels or anything shiny, just a messy collection of old maps, random trinkets, and what looked like a kaleidoscope with a cracked lens. She grabbed the kaleidoscope and handed it to me. This is how you find the door, she said. At this point, I was fully charmed by the whole situation, so I looked through it. The world shifted in a way I wasn't expecting. Through the cracked lens, the alley seemed to stretch infinitely, the graffiti on the walls swirling like it was alive, the puddles glowing faintly. I lowered it and blinked. Everything was normal again. Cool trick, I said, but the girl was already pointing at the end of the alley. The door's that way. You just have to go fast before it disappears. She giggled and ran off before I could ask what she meant. I stood there for a moment, kaleidoscope still in hand, debating whether I should feel concerned or amused. Ultimately, curiosity won. I walked to the end of the alley, raised the kaleidoscope to my eye again, and looked. What I saw didn't make sense. The alley wasn't there anymore. In its place was a sunlit field, rolling hills dotted with wildflowers, and a winding dirt path that seemed to lead somewhere just out of sight. I pulled the kaleidoscope down, expecting to see the damp gray alley again, but the field remained. I turned around. The city was gone. Behind me was a forest, dense and ancient, the kind you'd only ever see in fairy tales. I was still holding my coffee money, 5 crumpled dollars in my left hand, as if that mattered anymore. The air smelled different, sweet and earthy, with a hint of something I couldn't place. I didn't know what else to do, so I followed the path. It felt like walking into a dream. Every step brought something new. A cluster of glowing mushrooms tucked under a tree, a flock of birds that shimmered like oil in the sunlight, the distant sound of a flute echoing from somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. Time felt slippery, unimportant. It could have been minutes or hours before I reached the edge of a lake. The water was so still it looked like glass, and in the center of it floated a tiny rowboat, tied to a post on the shore. The boat didn't seem like it belonged to anyone, so I climbed in. As soon as I sat down, it began to drift, slowly at first, then with more purpose. The world around me seemed to blur, the colors brighter but softer, the edges of things melting into each other. I felt weightless, untethered, like I was both inside my body and outside of it at the same time. I think I smiled. I think I cried. I don't know. I just remember feeling full, like my heart was too big for my chest. The boat stopped at a small island covered in white sand. Waiting there was a man with a beard, so wild it looked like it could house a dozen birds. He didn't speak, just handed me a single blue feather and gestured back to the boat. I didn't question it. The feather was soft and warm, almost alive, and when I held it, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. Like everything in my life, every mistake, every regret, had been leading me to this exact moment. I didn't understand it, but I didn't need to. When the boat brought me back to the lake's edge, the forest looked different. The trees were smaller, thinner, less magical. The air felt heavier, like it was pulling me back to reality. I walked back along the path, and with each step, the colors dimmed. By the time I reached the spot where I'd first arrived, I was back in the alley. The kaleidoscope was gone. The little girl was gone. My $5 were still in my hand. I didn't get coffee that day. I walked home in a daze, replaying everything in my head, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I reached into my hoodie pocket later that evening, I found the blue feather. It's on my bookshelf now, tucked between 2 novels I've never gotten around to reading. Sometimes I take it out just to hold it, to remind myself that there's more to the world than what we see every day. Have you ever had a regular day suddenly turn into an unforgettable adventure? I was walking through the park yesterday, one of those vast, open ones that feel more like a piece of countryside than part of the city. The kind of place where you can still catch the faint smell of damp earth after it rains, where people bring their dogs to chase sticks and their kids to stomp in puddles. It had been drizzling earlier, just enough to leave tiny beads of water clinging to the grass like diamonds, and the air had that crisp sharpness that only comes after a storm. I wasn't in a hurry, just strolling with my hands in my pockets, watching the world move at its own unhurried pace, when I noticed something peculiar. Not unusual, exactly, but something I hadn't really paid attention to before. There was a man in a business suit sitting on a bench. That alone wasn't strange. People sit on benches all the time. But this guy looked wildly out of place, like someone had plucked him out of a skyscraper office and dropped him here as an experiment. He had one of those sleek leather briefcases propped against his leg and shiny shoes that were probably regretting their decision to venture into the damp park. But here's what caught my attention. He was sitting perfectly still, staring down at what I initially thought was his phone. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a phone at all. It was a tiny plastic dinosaur. A bright red stegosaurus, to be exact, small enough to fit in his palm. He was holding it like it was something precious, turning it over carefully as though he was committing every ridge and bump to memory. I don't know why this moment fascinated me so much. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the contrast, the polished, professional man and his goofy little dinosaur. But the longer I watched, the more it seemed intentional. He wasn't embarrassed or trying to hide it. He wasn't on a phone call or lost in thought. He was just sitting there, fully absorbed in this small, vibrant piece of plastic. I wondered if it belonged to his child, maybe a toy that had accidentally slipped into his pocket that morning, and now he was holding it as a connection to a world far removed from his meetings and spreadsheets. Or maybe it wasn't his kid's at all. Maybe it was his. Maybe it had been on his desk for years, a secret rebellion against adulthood, and he carried it around as a reminder not to take life too seriously. As I walked past him, I tried not to stare too hard, but it was difficult. Something about him made the world around him feel quieter, like everything else in the park. The barking dogs, the joggers, the laughter from the playground had faded into the background, leaving just him and his little red dinosaur in a bubble of calm. For a brief second, I wanted to ask him about it, to hear the story behind the toy, but I didn't. The moment felt too personal, too delicate, and I didn't want to intrude. That should have been the end of it, a curious little scene to carry with me for the rest of the day, but it wasn't. As I kept walking, I started noticing more tiny, unusual moments that seemed to hold the same kind of quiet magic. A woman on a bench further down the path had a stack of index cards in her lap, flipping through them with a look of intense concentration. I thought she might be studying for a test, but as I got closer, I saw they weren't notes or vocabulary words. They were doodles, little sketches of birds and trees, some as simple as stick figures, others so detailed you could see the individual feathers on a sparrow. Her pencil was tucked behind her ear, and she occasionally pulled it out to add a line or a shadow, then slipped it back like a magician hiding a wand. A little further on, a guy in an oversized hoodie was sprawled out on the grass, earbuds in, scribbling something furiously in a notebook. It wasn't homework. I could tell that much from the way he'd crossed out half of what he'd written and filled the margins with arrows and notes. He wasn't solving problems. He was creating something, though I couldn't tell what. Maybe a story, maybe a song, maybe just fragments of thoughts that felt too big to keep in his head. He paused now and then to glance around, as though the trees and the sky might offer him inspiration. There was a certain wildness to his energy, like he was completely consumed by whatever was flowing out of his mind and onto the page. It was like the entire park had been taken over by this quiet, creative energy, little pockets of people immersed in their own tiny worlds, doing things that probably didn't seem important to anyone else but clearly meant the world to them. A teenage girl leaned against a tree, humming softly as she braided long strands of grass into tiny crowns. A man was standing ankle-deep in the pond with his pant legs rolled up, balancing on one leg while he tried to fish out something that had fallen in. I think it was a baseball. Two kids were crouched near the edge of the path, whispering like they were planning some grand heist. Their hands cupped around a ladybug they were trying to coax onto a stick. I think what struck me most about all of it was how much care everyone was pouring into these seemingly insignificant moments. None of it had any obvious purpose. It wasn't work or obligation. No one was trying to impress anyone or win anything. They were just being, doing these small, personal things that probably made their days feel a little brighter, a little more meaningful. It was like they were carving out these tiny spaces for joy and curiosity, even if only for a few minutes. By the time I left the park, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been let in on a secret I wasn't supposed to know. There's this strange kind of beauty in the way people express themselves when no one's watching, when they think their actions don't matter to anyone but themselves. A plastic dinosaur, a pencil sketch, a blade of grass twisted into a crown. None of it has to be significant to be meaningful. So now I can't stop wondering. What's something small and unexpected that you've seen someone do just for the sake of joy? Something that didn't make sense at first but stayed with you long after it ended? Because honestly, I think those are the moments that make life feel the most alive. We met up at an art museum. She said she liked places where she could feel small in front of something big, and I thought that was such a strange, poetic way to describe looking at a bunch of paintings on walls. I remember wondering if she said things like that all the time, if that was just her way of moving through the world. And maybe that's what drew me to her. She wasn't trying to impress me, or anyone, really. She just looked at everything like it had a story to tell and made you want to listen. When I got there, she was already waiting outside. Her scarf was a mess. Wrapped so many times around her neck, it looked like it was winning some kind of battle against the cold. She smiled as soon as she saw me, a big, unapologetic grin that made me feel like I was the only person in the city. She had this old Polaroid camera hanging from her neck, one of those clunky ones with a strap that looked like it might snap at any moment. She caught me staring at it. "It still works," she said proudly, patting it like it was some kind of loyal pet. "It's a little temperamental, though. Like me." Then she winked, and I was pretty sure I was done for. Inside, the museum was quiet, almost reverent. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of the sound of your own shoes on the polished floors. She moved slowly, taking her time with each painting like she was in conversation with it. At first, I tried to keep up, matching her pace and watching her from the corner of my eye, but I quickly realized there was no point. She was in her own world. We ended up in a room with a massive painting that took up an entire wall. It was chaotic, all sharp lines and clashing colors, like someone had poured their soul onto the canvas in one messy, beautiful eruption. She stood in front of it for a long time, arms crossed, head tilted to one side. Then, without looking at me, she said, "What do you see?" I stared at the painting, trying to come up with something smart or profound, but all I could see was chaos. "Honestly," I said, "it kind of looks like a fight broke out in a paint store." She laughed, loud enough that a couple of nearby museum goers glanced over disapprovingly, but she didn't care. "You're not wrong," she said, "but I think it's more than that. It's like someone's trying to say something, but they don't know how, so they just throw everything out there and hope someone will understand." I didn't say anything, but I looked at the painting again, and for the first time, I started to see it the way she did. Like it wasn't just chaos, it was vulnerability. And maybe that was what made it beautiful. We wandered through the rest of the museum, and at some point, I noticed she wasn't looking at the paintings anymore. Instead, she was pointing her Polaroid camera at the little details people usually ignored. The way the sunlight hit the marble floor, the shadows of the frames on the walls, even the expressions on people's faces as they stared at the art. She took a picture of me, too, catching me completely off guard. "Why'd you do that?" I asked, laughing a little as the Polaroid whirred and spat out the photo. She shrugged. "You were looking at something like it mattered," she said simply. "That's worth remembering." We ended up at the museum cafe, sharing a tiny table and drinking coffee out of cups that were too small for my hands. She pulled out the stack of Polaroids she'd taken that day, fanning them out on the table like playing cards. I leaned in to look, and that's when I saw it. A photo she must have taken while I wasn't paying attention. It was of me, standing in front of that chaotic painting, my arms at my sides, my head tilted at the exact same angle hers had been. The way she'd framed it, the painting towered over me, like I was this tiny figure lost in its immensity. "I think you get it more than you realize," she said softly, tapping the photo with her finger. I wanted to say something, but the words caught in my throat. All I could think about was how she saw the world, and how, for some reason, she'd chosen to share that with me. And maybe that's why it hit me so hard when she said what she said next. "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for someone to see you?" she asked, not looking up from her coffee. Her voice was casual, almost offhand, but there was something fragile in the question, like she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I guess I don't really know what that would look like." She nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on her cup. "I think it looks like this," she said, motioning to the Polaroids on the table. "Little moments, caught when you're not paying attention. That's when you're most yourself, you know? When you're not trying to be anything for anyone." The simplicity of her words floored me. It wasn't just what she said, but the way she said it, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like she had already figured out something I hadn't even known I was looking for. We stayed there until the museum started to close, talking about nothing and everything. When we finally left, the city was wrapped in twilight, the streets glowing with that soft, golden light that makes everything feel a little more magical than it really is. As we walked to the subway, she handed me the Polaroid of me in front of the painting. "Keep it," she said. In case you forget what it looks like to matter. I don't know why that hit me the way it did. Maybe it was the way she said it, so matter of fact, like it wasn't even a question. Or maybe it was because, in that moment, I realized she'd been seeing me the whole time. Really seeing me. In a way I wasn't sure anyone else ever had. I still have that Polaroid. It's tucked into a book I'll never lend out. The edges a little worn from the number of times I've pulled it out to look at it. And every time I do, I think about her and the way she could find beauty in chaos, and how, just for one day, she made me believe I could, too. Have you ever had someone show you a side of yourself you didn't even know was there? The rain fell in dense sheets, a relentless percussion against the steel rooftops of Varnum, a city that had no reason to exist but stubbornly did. Elena crouched behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, her breath rising in small puffs as the cold bit into her fingers. She clutched the small vial tightly, its contents swirling with a faint iridescence that seemed alive. They were close now. She could feel them. The alley ahead was empty save for the wind, and the glow of a neon sign advertising a noodle shop that had been shuttered for years. She darted across, boots splashing in shallow puddles, and pressed herself into the shadows beneath a broken fire escape. The vial hummed faintly against her palm, a sound only she could hear. It was getting louder. Somewhere to her left, a door slammed open. A man's voice barked orders in a language she didn't recognize, but the urgency was unmistakable. They had found her trail. She adjusted the strap of the bag slung over her shoulder and slipped into the narrow corridor that ran between the tenements. It reeked of rot and oil, but it was darker here, and she needed the dark. The vial grew warmer as she moved deeper into the maze of alleys, almost burning against her skin. "Not yet," she whispered, cradling it as though it could hear her. She wasn't sure it couldn't. The pursuit grew louder. Boots on wet pavement, the buzz of a radio, the occasional shout. These weren't ordinary mercenaries. She'd seen what they could do. Ahead, the corridor opened into a courtyard, its edges choked with overgrown weeds. In the center stood a statue, its features weathered beyond recognition, arms outstretched as though pleading with the heavens. The vial vibrated now, tugging against her grip like it had a will of its own. Elena hesitated. She'd been warned about this moment, though the warning had been vague and cryptic, like everything else about this job. The man who'd handed her the vial, a figure with half his face scarred and the other half hidden behind an intricate brass mask, had only said, "When it calls, let it go." The air in the courtyard shifted, heavy and charged. The shadows grew longer, twisting in ways that defied logic. She couldn't tell if the movement behind her was real or imagined, but she didn't wait to find out. She ran to the base of the statue and, with a deep breath, opened her hand. The vial leapt from her palm, hovering mid-air as if held by invisible threads. The light inside flared, brighter and brighter until it filled the entire courtyard. Elena shielded her eyes, but through the cracks in her fingers, she saw shapes forming in the light. Figures, tall and angular, their outlines sharp against the glow. They didn't belong to this world. The voices came next. Not the guttural shouts of the men chasing her, but a chorus of whispers, layered and overlapping, speaking in a language she didn't know yet understood completely. "You carry a key. Now choose the door." The ground beneath her trembled. The statue cracked, fissures spidering out across its surface. From its chest emerged a swirling vortex, its edges lined with shimmering patterns that shifted every time she blinked. The whispers grew louder. "Choose." Behind her, the sound of boots closed in. Elena turned to see them, figures in sleek black uniforms, their faces obscured by mirrored visors. They raised their weapons in unison. She looked back at the vortex. It pulsed like a heartbeat, synchronizing with the vial's glow. She thought of the man with the brass mask, the way he'd gripped her shoulder as he spoke. Not every door is meant to be opened. The men shouted something, an ultimatum, maybe, or a warning. She didn't wait to hear the end of it. With a single step, she threw herself into the vortex. It wasn't like falling. It wasn't like flying either. It was like being stretched and compressed simultaneously. Every molecule in her body pulled apart and reassembled in the same instant. When she landed, it was silent. The rain was gone. The city was gone. She stood in a vast expanse of white, featureless except for a single figure standing a few paces away. It was the man with the brass mask. "Welcome," he said, his voice calm but weighted with something she couldn't place. "You've crossed the first threshold. What is this place?" Elena asked, her voice echoing strangely. He gestured to the empty expanse. "The in-between. A pause before the journey continues." She frowned. "I don't understand. The vial is not what you think," he interrupted. "But you already knew that." He stepped closer, and she noticed for the first time that his mask wasn't solid. It moved, the brass flowing like liquid, reshaping itself every few seconds. "You've proven yourself capable, but capability isn't enough. There's still the matter of intent." "I just want to survive," she said, though it felt like a lie as she said it. "Do you?" His tone was neither mocking nor kind. "Or is it something more?" Before she could answer, the white expanse began to crack, fractures spreading outward like a pane of shattered glass. The man stepped back, his mask shifting into something sharp and angular. "This is where you decide." The ground gave way beneath her, and she was falling again, this time with no end in sight. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, each word carving itself into her mind. When she hit the ground, the world was no longer white. It was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the vial, which was once again in her hand. Around her were shapes, twisted, looming, and alive, and they were waiting. There was a night, years ago, when the world felt strangely quiet, as if even the stars were holding their breath. I had been on a handful of dates with her at that point, enough to know she made me nervous in the best way, but not enough to understand why her silences lingered, or why she sometimes looked away mid-conversation, her gaze slipping off like a bookmark falling from a well-loved novel. It was one of those evenings that came together without much planning. Pizza at a tiny, family-run spot, then a walk by the river. January had bitten the air, but she didn't seem to mind, her hands tucked deep into her coat pockets as we wandered along the water. She was the kind of person who could make the simplest things feel important. The way she folded her napkin, the thoughtful pauses before she spoke, how she always noticed the music playing in the background of a restaurant and leaned in, almost like she was listening for something only she could hear. That night, though, she seemed a little more distracted than usual, like there was something circling in her mind that she couldn't quite put to words. I caught myself overthinking the silence. Was she bored? Was I talking too much, or not enough? My thoughts spiraled, and I could feel my confidence shrinking, the way it does when you care too much about making the right impression. We stopped to sit on a bench overlooking the river. The water reflected the streetlights like shards of glass scattered over black velvet, and the cold was just sharp enough to sting in your lungs. I was about to crack some awkward joke about the weather, the kind you make when the silence starts to feel too heavy, but before I could, she spoke. "Can I show you something?" she asked, her voice quiet but deliberate, like she'd been rehearsing the question in her head. I nodded, unsure what she meant, but curious enough to let her take the lead. She pulled off her gloves, her fingers red from the cold, and unzipped her coat slightly. From her inside pocket, she drew out a small, folded piece of paper. It looked worn, the edges soft and frayed as if it had been handled 1,000 times. Without saying anything, she unfolded it and held it out for me to see. It was a crayon drawing, the kind a child might make, all uneven lines and colors that didn't quite stay inside the shapes. It was a picture of two stick figures holding hands, standing under a crooked rainbow. The sky was purple, the sun had a smiley face, and the figures were surrounded by an explosion of bright, mismatched colors that didn't make any sense but somehow felt exactly right. At the bottom, written in wobbly block letters, was the word "Mommy." For a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. I looked at her, and she wasn't smiling or trying to explain it away. Her face was soft, but there was an unmistakable weight in her expression, the kind of heaviness that comes from carrying something alone for too long. I waited, sensing that whatever this was, it wasn't the kind of thing you rush through. "It's from my daughter," she finally said. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled just slightly as she took the paper back. She made it for me when she was 5. She paused, folding the drawing again with the kind of care you might give to an ancient, priceless relic. I lost her about 6 years ago. I felt my breath catch, not because of what she said, although yes, the enormity of her words hit me like a wave I wasn't ready for, but because of the way she said it. There was no anger or bitterness in her tone, just a quiet, aching tenderness, like she was holding onto the warmth of that memory even as it burned her. I wanted to say something, anything, but every word felt too small, too clumsy for the moment. So I didn't speak. I just sat there, letting her decide if there was more she wanted to say. She had this way of making the world brighter, she continued, her eyes locked on the folded paper in her hands. Even at 5, she just knew how to love people, completely, without conditions. And she stopped, blinking quickly, as if trying to push back tears. I try to carry that with me, every day. Some days I fail, but then I think about this. She held up the folded drawing, and it helps. Her words settled into the space between us, filling it with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was deeper than that, fuller, like the kind of grief that somehow teaches you how to keep moving, even when the weight feels unbearable. I looked at her, at the quiet strength in the set of her jaw, at the way her breath rose and fell in the cold, steady despite everything. And in that moment, I realized how little I'd known her before this. I'd been drawn to her because she was interesting and kind, but now, sitting there with her in the biting January air, I saw her in a completely different light. She wasn't just someone I liked. She was someone I deeply, genuinely admired. I reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second before resting my hand over hers. "Thank you for sharing that with me," I said softly, the words barely louder than the hum of the river. She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine as if trying to decide whether I meant it. And whatever she saw in my face, it must have been enough, because she nodded, just once, and laced her fingers through mine. We stayed like that for a while, our hands clasped together, the cold biting at our cheeks, but neither of us moving to leave. The world around us seemed to fade, and all I could feel was the quiet strength of her presence beside me. I don't remember how long we sat there. It could have been minutes, or hours, or lifetimes. But I do remember the way she looked at me when we finally stood to leave, like she was seeing me differently too. Like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't carrying that weight entirely alone anymore. I think about that night often, not just because of what she shared, but because of how she shared it, with so much honesty and vulnerability that it made me want to be a better person, just by knowing her. It was one of those rare moments in life that stays with you, shaping the way you see the world and the people in it. Have you ever had a moment on a date that stayed with you forever? The kind of sound you notice just before falling asleep, soft enough to ignore but persistent enough to burrow into your thoughts. At first, I thought it was the pipes. Old houses do that sometimes, groan, shift, let you know they're still alive. But by the second night, the hum was louder. Not pipes, not the fridge, not anything I could name. I tried to find the source. I pressed my ear to the cold wooden planks in the hallway, convinced I'd hear whispers of water or the scuttle of rodents. But there was nothing beneath the hum, just a faint vibration, like the ground itself was holding its breath. My landlord, a man named Mr. Denton who looked like he'd been in a permanent state of confusion since 1973, waved me off when I brought it up. "The house is old," he said, chewing on a toothpick. "Old houses make sounds. You'll get used to it." But by the third night, I didn't get used to it. I heard tapping. It started at 1:17 a.m. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap beneath my bed. I froze, mid-turn in my sheets, suddenly hyper-aware of how loud my breathing had become. Tap, tap, tap. A perfect rhythm, like someone was drumming their fingers against the wood. I did what anyone would do when faced with something creepy in the dark. I stayed perfectly still and pretended I was invisible. But the tapping didn't stop. I eventually fell asleep with the blankets pulled to my chin, telling myself it was a trick of the wind, a branch against the side of the house. The next morning, I found the first mark, a tiny hole in the floor, no wider than the tip of a pencil, right next to my bed. It was perfectly circular, like it had been drilled there overnight. I stared at it for longer than I care to admit, poking at it with my finger before realizing I was absolutely not about to lose a digit to whatever was under the floor. I told myself it was nothing, maybe termites, or a knot in the wood. But that night, the tapping started again. This time, it didn't stop at the floor. I heard it coming from the walls, the ceiling, moving slowly, as though something, or someone, was searching for something. The sound followed me into the kitchen when I grabbed a glass of water. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, deliberate. Close. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in my living room with every light on, coffee in hand, staring at the floor like it owed me answers. I was halfway through debating whether I should call an exterminator, a priest, or just burn the place down when I saw the second hole. It was in the corner of the room, next to the baseboard, identical to the first. The next day, I told Mr. Denton again. This time, he stared at me for a long moment before leaning in close and saying, "Did you disturb it?" "What?" He chewed his toothpick. "The house," he said. "Sometimes these places have rules. Don't disturb them." I blinked. "You're saying the house is doing this?" "Could be," he said with a shrug. "Could be the thing beneath it. Best leave it alone." That was the exact opposite of helpful. I went home and paced for hours, staring at the holes like they might explain themselves if I looked long enough. And maybe I would have listened to Mr. Denton. Maybe I would have left it alone, if not for what happened that night. The tapping came back, but this time, there was singing. It was faint, almost too soft to catch, but the sound drifted up through the holes in the floor like smoke curling under a door. A high, lilting voice humming a melody that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It wasn't a song I recognized, but it felt old, like something forgotten and half-remembered. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and crouched next to the hole by my bed. I hesitated. Then, moving slowly, I pressed my eye to it. At first, I saw nothing, just darkness. But as my vision adjusted, I realized the darkness was moving. Shadows shifted, flickering in impossible shapes like something slithering just out of sight. And then I saw the eye. A single, pale eye staring back at me from the other side of the hole, unblinking and too wide to belong to anything human. I shot back so fast I hit the bed frame, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The singing stopped. So did the tapping. The house fell silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like something was listening, waiting. I didn't sleep. I didn't dare turn off the lights. The next morning, I packed a bag and called a friend to let me crash at their place for a while. I was halfway out the door when I heard it, a soft creak, like footsteps in the hallway behind me. I turned, and there, just peeking out from beneath the floorboard near the living room, was a hand. Thin, pale fingers curling against the wood, as if testing the air. I froze, my breath stuck in my throat, as the hand slowly withdrew, disappearing into the dark. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car with the engine running, watching the house through the rearview mirror like I expected it to chase me. I didn't look back when I pulled away. I moved out the next week. Mr. Denton didn't seem surprised when I told him. "It happens sometimes," was all he said. "They don't like being watched." I didn't ask who they were. I didn't want to know. Months later, I heard the house was empty again. People come and go, renting it for a while before leaving without explanation. No one stays long. Every now and then, I think about the holes, the tapping, the singing, and wonder what's still beneath those floorboards, waiting, listening. I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. If you ever hear tapping in the middle of the night, don't look for the source. Don't listen for the singing. And whatever you do, don't look through the holes. Some things don't like to be seen. I'm not sure when I started noticing the small things, but this morning they stood out like tiny constellations scattered across an ordinary sky. It was just a regular Tuesday in the city. One of those days where nothing remarkable happens except for everything. I was walking to the bus stop, the same one I've used 100 times, when I caught a snippet of someone's conversation as they passed me on the sidewalk. I don't even remember what they said. Something about the price of coffee or an annoying coworker, but it stuck to me like the faintest trace of perfume, lingering just long enough to make me wonder, Isn't it strange how a single passing sentence can worm its way into your thoughts, even when it's not meant for you? It's like eavesdropping on the soundtrack of life and realizing that everyone else's song plays just as loudly as yours, even if you can only hear it in fragments. The bus stop was alive with the choreography of a morning. People were standing in their usual loose scatter, the kind of spacing that's neither too close nor too far. An unspoken agreement that no one ever teaches but everyone seems to know. I watched a woman pull her scarf tighter against the cold while scrolling on her phone, her thumb moving with quick, practiced precision. Next to her, a man in a suit was tapping his foot to some invisible rhythm, earbuds in, lips moving slightly as if he was having a private conversation with the music. A teenager leaned against the pole, head tilted back, staring at the sky as if the clouds might answer whatever question was written on his face. The funny thing is, no one was talking to each other, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like being part of a quiet, collective hum, a group of strangers sharing the same moment, each contributing their own barely audible note. And then the bus came, roaring into view like an oversized beast shaking off the cold. People moved in sync, their bodies shifting and stepping forward without hesitation, forming a line that wasn't quite a line but worked anyway. It struck me, standing there, how much of our lives run on these invisible scripts. Nobody told us how to do this, not explicitly, but we all just know. We know how to queue up, how to angle our shoulders so we don't bump into each other as we board, how to avoid eye contact without seeming rude. It's as if we're all actors in a play we've rehearsed for years without realizing it, improvising the parts where the script gets fuzzy but never straying too far from the story. I grabbed a seat by the window and let my gaze wander outside, where the city was doing its usual thing. Cars honked at each other with the kind of casual impatience that feels more like routine than anger. A guy on a bike wove through traffic like he was threading a needle, his movements so fluid it was almost hypnotic. On the corner, a woman was walking her dog, and for some reason, the sight of it, a small white fluff ball trotting confidently on tiny legs, made me smile. I didn't know her or the dog, but for a brief second, I felt connected to them. Isn't that wild? To think we can feel a flicker of warmth for someone we'll never speak to, just because they exist in the same frame as us for half a heartbeat. The bus stopped at a red light, and I glanced around the passengers. A young couple sat across from me, their heads bent close together over the same phone screen. Whatever they were looking at must have been funny, because they kept stifling their laughter, nudging each other like they were trying not to disturb the quiet. Behind them, an older woman was knitting something. A scarf, maybe? Her hands moved in small, precise motions, and I found myself mesmerized by the rhythm of it. A kid near the front was playing some game on his tablet, his face scrunched up in deep concentration, while his mom scrolled through what I assumed was an endless feed of social media posts. And in the back corner, a guy in a hoodie was leaning against the window, fast asleep, his breath fogging up the glass. It hit me then, this overwhelming sense of wonder at how beautifully organized all of this chaos was. None of these people knew each other, yet here we all were, moving together through the city like different streams flowing into the same river. I thought about how everything we do, the big, important decisions and the tiny, meaningless ones, ripples out into the world in ways we'll never fully understand. Like that overheard snippet of conversation earlier. It was already fading from my memory, but who knows? Maybe it'll resurface someday, tucked into the back of my mind, and make me think of something I wouldn't have otherwise. Maybe someone on this bus will remember the sight of the older woman knitting or the sound of the couple's laughter, and it'll make them smile later for reasons they can't quite explain. When the bus finally reached my stop, I stepped off and joined the flow of people on the sidewalk, each of us heading somewhere different but walking the same stretch of concrete for a few fleeting seconds. I wondered how many times I've passed these same faces without noticing, how many lives have brushed up against mine in ways too small to measure. It's a strange thought, isn't it? To think of yourself not as the center of your own story, but as a passing extra in someone else's, a background character who's part of the scenery but never the plot. As I stood at the crosswalk waiting for the light to change, I caught my reflection in the window of a coffee shop. For a second, I felt like a traveler in my own city, seeing it all for the first time with fresh eyes. The way people darted in and out of the door with cups in hand. The way the barista behind the counter moved like they were conducting an orchestra of steam and espresso shots. The way the smell of roasted beans seemed to cling to the air like a second atmosphere. It all felt so alive, so wonderfully ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. The light turned green, and I crossed the street, letting the city swallow me back into its rhythm. I couldn't shake the feeling that these tiny, nearly invisible things, the snippets of conversations, the unspoken rules, the fleeting connections, are what hold everything together. They're the glue of our shared humanity, the threads that weave us into this vast, intricate tapestry where no one thread is more important than the others. So, here's my question. What part of our everyday society makes you feel like a traveler in your own world? There's a coffee shop I like to visit on lazy afternoons, the kind of place that always smells like cinnamon and has mismatched chairs, where baristas write your name in curly fonts on the cup. It's a little slice of comfort in a busy world, a spot where the hum of espresso machines blends seamlessly with quiet conversations and the occasional hiss of milk being steamed. I was sitting by the window last Thursday, the sunlight streaming in at just the right angle to give the wood floors a golden glow, when I noticed something that made me pause mid-sip of my chai latte. A girl, probably in her 20s, was standing near the counter with her phone raised. Not in that robotic, I have to take a selfie way, but with a sense of careful precision, like an artist positioning her canvas. She was angling it toward the pastries in the display case. Glossy croissants, cookies with chunks of chocolate still soft from the oven, little tarts dusted with powdered sugar. I thought she might snap a quick picture and be done with it, but no. She crouched slightly, adjusted her hair, tilted her phone again, and then, as if the stars had aligned, she clicked the photo. What struck me wasn't the act itself. People take pictures of food all the time. But the look on her face when she checked the photo. There it was, that tiny flicker of pride, the little yes, this is perfect moment that you don't often get to see on someone's face in real time. I don't know why it hit me the way it did, but it stayed with me. There was something inherently beautiful about how much care she put into capturing that fleeting moment. I'm sure to some people it might seem silly, taking so much effort to immortalize a pastry that would be gone in a matter of bites, but it felt like something more than that. She wasn't just taking a picture. She was pausing the chaos of life to find something lovely, to freeze it and say, hey, this mattered for a second. And the funny thing is, once I noticed her, I started seeing it everywhere. At the table next to me, a young couple was laughing over their phones, tilting their screens toward each other and gesturing wildly, sharing memes or videos in a way that seemed like they were having a private party right in the middle of the cafe. An older man in a flat cap was scrolling through what looked like an online recipe for chicken soup, his phone precariously balanced on the edge of his saucer. Two teens by the counter were holding up drinks with whipped cream peaks and sprinkling them with tiny bits of chocolate, giggling as they debated who had the better Instagram angle. Everyone was interacting with their phones in ways that felt oddly wholesome. I know there's this idea floating around that technology has made us more distant, that we're all glued to our screens and forgetting how to be human. And I get where that comes from. I've had my fair share of dinners where someone's face was lit by the glow of their notifications instead of candlelight. But sitting there in that cafe, it didn't feel like technology was pulling people apart. If anything, it felt like it was bringing them closer together. That girl with her pastry photo? She wasn't just taking a picture. She was probably about to share it with a friend, or maybe even hundreds of strangers online, hoping to spark a little joy. The couple showing each other videos was sharing something that made them laugh so hard they had to stifle snorts. The teens with their whipped cream drinks were clearly bonding over their shared love of sugary, over-the-top beverages, and their mutual dedication to making those drinks look as photogenic as possible. It made me think about how often I hear people say, "Oh, I hate how obsessed everyone is with their phones," when, really, the obsession doesn't seem to be with the phones themselves but with what they allow us to do. Sure, we scroll mindlessly sometimes, but we also capture moments we never want to forget, share jokes that make us laugh until our stomachs hurt, and find solutions to problems we didn't even know we could solve. I mean, that man in the flat cap? Maybe he was about to cook chicken soup for someone he loves, and his phone was just helping him do it right. When I left the cafe that day, I kept noticing it. On the subway, There was a woman reading an ebook, her lips moving silently as she absorbed every word. A kid was watching a cartoon with big, delighted eyes while his mom tapped away on her phone, probably answering an urgent email or planning dinner for later. A man in a sharp suit was holding his phone up for a quick selfie, adjusting his tie with his free hand and grinning like he was sending it to someone he hadn't seen in a while. Everywhere I looked, people were using technology not to detach from the world, but to engage with it in tiny, personal ways. Even at home that evening, I caught myself scrolling through my phone with a different mindset, looking at it less as a distraction and more as a tool for connection. I opened a photo from a trip I took last year, a snapshot of the sun setting behind a mountain range, and I realized I hadn't just taken it to remember the view. I'd taken it because it had moved me so much I wanted to share it with my best friend back home. I found myself wondering how many people out there had taken a picture, posted a status, or shared a video in the hopes that someone, somewhere, would see it and feel a little less alone. That girl in the coffee shop probably doesn't remember the moment she took that photo. She might have already deleted it or buried it in a folder with thousands of others, and I doubt she'd ever imagined someone watching her and being struck by how much joy she poured into such a small act. But I remember it. I think I always will. Maybe that's what I love most about living in the modern world. The way people take these tiny moments, a perfect croissant, a funny video, a recipe for soup, and weave them into something bigger, something that connects us all, even if we don't realize it. So, now I'm curious. Is there a modern trend or habit you've noticed that makes life feel just a little brighter? Something small, maybe even silly, but undeniably warm and human? I'd love to hear about it. Every time I fall for someone, I start tasting colors. Yes, tasting them. Like, full-on, mouthfuls of sensation colors that don't belong anywhere except in the wildest fever dreams of someone who has accidentally licked a rainbow. The first time it happened, I was 13, and I had this huge crush on a kid named Owen. He sat next to me in art class, and for reasons my teenage brain couldn't explain, the sight of his lopsided grin made me feel like I was about to combust. Then one day, as I was mixing paint for a landscape project, I dipped my brush into the deepest shade of blue I'd ever seen, and bam! It hit me. Blue. It tasted like saltwater taffy and that soft, clean breath of air you get when you first step onto a beach. My mouth literally watered. I looked around to see if anyone else noticed what had just happened, if someone else was drooling like a lunatic because of blue. But no, everyone was just painting trees and clouds like the world wasn't suddenly made of flavors. From then on, the colors wouldn't leave me alone. Whenever I looked at Owen, flashes of blue would swim across my vision. On his pencil, on the sleeves of his sweatshirt, even reflected in his stupid brown eyes, and I'd taste that same sweet, salty breeze. The crush faded, eventually, and when it did, the blue went with it. I didn't think about it again until years later, when it came back with a vengeance. Her name was Mia. She was the first person I'd ever seen wear a mustard yellow coat and look good doing it. I noticed her in the library on a random Tuesday, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, her fingers tapping absent-mindedly against the spines of books while she read. The moment I saw her, yellow bloomed across my vision. But it wasn't any normal yellow. It was bright and golden, like sunshine poured through honey. And then I tasted it. It was sharp and sweet, like candied ginger. Warm, like biting into a slice of fresh bread straight out of the oven. I had to sit down to process it because, honestly, who expects to be blindsided by yellow in the middle of a library? After that, yellow followed Mia everywhere. Her coat, her sticky notes, the highlighter she used when she studied. And every time, I'd get that same golden warmth in my mouth, as if her very presence made the world taste better. By then, I'd accepted that this weird quirk of mine was here to stay. Every crush brought its own signature flavor and color. Some were easy to handle, like green, which appeared when I liked this guy from my community garden. Green tasted like fresh mint and the snap of biting into a cucumber on a hot day. Clean, simple, lovely. Others, though, not so pleasant. There was a girl named Kara who wore nothing but black and smoked clove cigarettes behind the library. I'd had a crush on her for maybe 2 weeks before black entered my life. And let me tell you, black does not taste good. It was bitter, like burnt coffee and charcoal. I could feel it sticking to the back of my throat whenever she passed me in the hall. I avoided her after that, which was probably for the best. The weirdest part of all of this is that I never choose the color. I never know what it's going to taste like. It's as if the universe looks at the person I like, shrugs, and thinks, yeah, let's make them taste like orange peels and cinnamon this time. And I'm just stuck dealing with it, trying to hide the fact that my senses are going haywire because someone smiled at me for half a second. But a few months ago, something new happened. Something I still don't understand. It started when I met Jonah. We'd both signed up for the same evening pottery class, and I swear, from the second he walked in, it was like the air around him shimmered. I braced myself, waiting for the color to hit, expecting to taste something bright or sharp or familiar. But nothing happened. No colors, no flavors, just Jonah, standing there, asking where the clay was kept. It threw me completely off balance. I spent weeks trying to figure him out, stealing glances while he worked on lopsided vases or absent-mindedly wiped clay off his nose. The colors never came, but I felt something anyway, a soft buzzing at the edges of my awareness, like a song I couldn't quite hear. Then, one night, as I sat across from Jonah in class, he laughed. One of those real, unrestrained laughs that come from deep in your chest. And that's when I saw it. Silver. A soft, shimmery silver that rippled like moonlight on water. I blinked, stunned, as the color wrapped around him, pooling like liquid metal at his fingertips. I braced myself for the taste, but it wasn't like the others. Silver wasn't a flavor. It was a feeling, cool and weightless, like the first breath of air after holding it underwater for too long. It filled my lungs, my chest, my whole body, and for the first time, the color didn't overwhelm me. It felt like mine, like I'd been waiting for it without knowing it. I looked up, and Jonah was watching me. He tilted his head slightly, smiling like he knew something I didn't. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I was. "Yeah, just distracted." Here's the part one still can't explain. When Jonah looked at me, his eyes flashed silver, too, just for a second, like the color was sharing itself between us. It's been a few weeks now, and the silver hasn't left. I don't taste it the way I did with the others. It just lingers around Jonah, quiet and constant, like it's not asking for attention. It's just there. I don't know what that means yet, but I've got a feeling I'm about to find out. So, tell me, have you ever felt something so vividly that it became real? Like the universe cracked open for just a moment and showed you the world the way it really is? Or am I the only one out here tasting people's souls and trying to figure out what silver is supposed to mean? I have this thing I do when I like someone. It's kind of embarrassing, but also, weirdly, my favorite thing about myself. You know how most people get butterflies or find excuses to bump into their crush? Well, I end up rehearsing fake conversations with them. Not just in my head, either. I act them out. Alone. Like, full-on standing in my kitchen at midnight, gesturing dramatically to the fridge as if it's my crush, trying to perfect the exact right combination of charm and wit that will make them fall head over heels for me. It's less preparation and more like I'm auditioning for some off-Broadway play titled The Perfect Encounter. The thing is, I don't realize I'm doing it until I'm deep into it. It'll start with a casual daydream, say, about the guy at work who always brings his dog to the office. Suddenly, I'm pacing my apartment with a mug of tea, pretending to say something like, "Oh, your dog loves peanut butter?" That's wild, because I was just reading this fascinating study about canine taste buds. Then I pause and shake my head. No, too nerdy. I mutter to myself, before trying again with, "Peanut butter, huh? So you're telling me he's smarter than half the people in Congress?" A little political edge, but still light and flirty. Perfect. This would all be fine if I could stop there, but my brain doesn't know how to quit. Soon, I'm doing accents. British, Australian, vaguely French, even though I cannot, for the life of me, figure out how to make it sound natural. I try different scenarios. Maybe we meet in a bookstore instead of the office. Maybe it's raining, and we both reach for the same umbrella at a cafe. Maybe I spill coffee on him, apologize profusely, and he laughs, telling me he's only wearing the shirt ironically because it says, "Don't talk to me until I've had my coffee." Which, by the way, would be an actual thing he'd do, because he really does wear sarcastic shirts to work. The fake conversations get so elaborate, I sometimes lose track of what's real. Once, I was in the grocery store, absent-mindedly testing out dialogue for this guy I liked who worked in IT. In my scenario, we were meeting in the produce aisle, and I was trying to come up with something funny about oranges. I must have been muttering out loud without realizing it, because some poor stranger overheard me saying, "Isn't it weird how oranges are the only fruit named after their color? Like, why don't we call bananas yellows?" He looked at me like I was certifiably insane and shuffled off toward the potatoes. It gets worse. One time, I accidentally used one of my rehearsed lines in real life, and not even with the person I'd been rehearsing for. I was in a meeting with my boss, who was wearing this obnoxiously bright Hawaiian shirt for Casual Friday. Without thinking, I blurted out, "Nice shirt. Did the 1970s personally deliver it to you?" He just stared at me, unamused, while the entire conference room went dead silent. That line had been meant for the guy I liked, and I had spent hours perfecting its delivery, wasted on my boss, of all people. Worse, it came off as rude instead of playful because, let's be honest, tone is everything, and apparently my flirty tone only works when I'm talking to my reflection. But here's the weirdest part. I don't just rehearse what I'm going to say. No, I script their responses too. In my little imaginary play, they always laugh at my jokes, banter back with just the right amount of sass, and drop these casual, heart-melting compliments that leave me swooning. I know it's unrealistic. I mean, who in real life says, "Wow, I've never met anyone who makes me feel so simultaneously at ease and exhilarated"? Nobody. That's who. But in my kitchen, at midnight, as I gaze lovingly at my refrigerator stand-in, that's exactly the kind of thing they'd say. The worst this habit ever got was when I dated someone for a little while and realized, horrifyingly, that I'd rehearsed so many conversations beforehand. I couldn't stop comparing our actual conversations to the fake ones I'd scripted. I'd ask him a question I'd rehearsed a dozen times. Something like, "What's the weirdest thing you've ever eaten?" And when his real answer, octopus at a sushi place, didn't match the answer I'd imagined, deep-fried tarantula in Cambodia, because I'm just that adventurous, I'd feel disappointed. Like he'd somehow gotten his own line wrong in the play I was secretly directing. To be clear, I don't want to control people or make them fit into some imaginary version of themselves. It's not that deep. It's more like my brain is overzealous in its excitement. It wants to make every moment perfect, every interaction memorable. I think it's because I'm secretly terrified of those awkward silences that can happen when you're around someone you like. You know the ones. They stretch out endlessly, and suddenly you're hyper-aware of every tiny movement, like the way you're holding your drink too tight or breathing too loud. My rehearsed conversations are my armor against those moments, a way to keep things light and easy and fun. The irony, of course, is that life doesn't care about my scripts. Real life is messy and unpredictable, and that's part of what makes it great. Like the time I finally talked to the guy with the dog at the office, and instead of dazzling him with my peanut butter factoid, I sneezed mid-sentence because I'm allergic to his dog's fur. He laughed so hard he snorted, and suddenly we were both just standing there, red-faced and giggling, and it was better than any line I could have rehearsed. So, yeah, I talk to my fridge at midnight and pretend it's my crush, and maybe I script things too much in my head. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The best moments, the ones that really stick with you, are the ones that take you completely by surprise. Anyway, that's my little romantic quirk. What about you? Do you have any weird or funny things you do when you like someone? Please tell me I'm not the only one out here mentally auditioning for conversations that will never happen.